I need to tell you something first before any of this makes sense. I worked in emergency planning for 11 years. 11 years of writing protocols for mass casualty events, infrastructure failures, pandemic response frameworks, shelter-in-place guidelines. I sat in conference rooms with county commissioners and health department directors and FEMA liaisons, and I drew flowcharts of what to do when things go wrong. I did tabletop exercises twice a year, where we'd role-play through disaster scenarios. Not zombie scenarios, obviously. Nobody had a zombie scenario. But pandemic spread modeling, civil unrest, rapid population displacement, critical infrastructure collapse. I'd done all of it. On paper, I was probably more prepared than almost anyone in the county to handle exactly the kind of situation that started on a Tuesday night in October. So when I tell you how badly I got things wrong in the first 6 hours, I want you to understand that the failure wasn't from ignorance. It was something else. It was the gap between knowing what to do and being able to make yourself do it when you're half asleep and scared and your kids are right down the hall. My name is Kevin Hartley. I am 41 years old. Was the Bryan County Emergency Planning Coordinator. And this is what happened. The Tuesday before all of this, I stayed late at the office to finish a funding proposal. Not because I was dedicated or anything like that. Mostly because our department was up for a budget review in November, and I needed the numbers to look a certain way, and I'd been putting it off for 3 weeks. It was the kind of paperwork that feels completely pointless when you're doing it, and apparently very necessary when a catastrophic event happens and somebody starts asking where the money went. I got home around 9. Diane was already in bed reading. The kids, our daughter Abby, who was 14, and our son Owen, who was 9, were technically asleep, which meant Owen was actually asleep and Abby was in her room, with her phone under the covers. I ate leftover pasta standing at the kitchen counter, too tired to sit down, checked the locks on the doors out of habit, and went to bed. I remember thinking, as I was falling asleep, that I needed to call back the county health director about the update to the respiratory illness response protocol. It was a thought I'd been carrying around for 2 weeks without doing anything about it. I told myself I'd do it Wednesday morning. I didn't make that call Wednesday morning, because at 2:17 in the morning on Wednesday, Walt Purcell knocked on my front door. Walt was our neighbor. He and his wife Carol had lived 3 houses down, the one with the dark blue shutters and the bad driveway, for about 12 years, since before we moved into the neighborhood. He was 63. Retired from an insurance company, spent his weekends on his boat on Crestwood Lake. Good neighbor in the practical sense, meaning he didn't have loud parties and he shoveled his walk and he waved when you drove by. We'd had them over for dinner maybe 4 times in however many years. I knew him well enough to know he drove a Ford F-150 and badly enough that I sometimes forgot his wife's name was Carol and called her Carla. I heard the knocking through my sleep, and it took me a second to locate it. Diane was already awake. She's always been a lighter sleeper than me. She was sitting up in the dark saying, "Kevin, someone's at the door." And I was sitting up too, and checking my phone for the time, and seeing 2:17 a.m., and feeling that specific low-grade alarm you get when someone knocks at 2 a.m., because that never means anything good. I told her to stay put and went downstairs. Through the glass panel next to the front door, I could see Walt standing on the porch. Even through the distorted glass, something about his posture looked wrong. I turned on the porch light and got a better look, and then I opened the door. His face was covered in blood, not a trickle, covered. The left side of his neck too, and his shirt down to his collar. He was holding his left arm across his chest at an angle that suggested something was wrong with it. Not exactly the way you'd hold a broken arm, but close. His eyes were open and tracking. He was breathing. He was standing up. All the basic signs of someone who was still functional. But he looked like he'd been through something terrible and come out the other side not entirely intact. "Walt," I said. He said, "Kevin." His voice was steady. That surprised me. "I need you to listen to me. Something is happening." I opened the door wider and started to say, "Come inside," and he stepped back instead of forward. "Don't," he said. "Stay there. I need you to listen, and then I need you to take your family and go." My brain was still doing the thing it does when you're woken up suddenly, running half a beat behind, requiring everything twice. Walt, what happened to you? Are you hurt? Let me call. Don't call anyone, he said it quickly. The 911 lines are. I tried twice. Something is happening on our street, Kevin. On the Miller's Street too. I came from that way. People are, I don't know what's happening to them. They're attacking people. I saw 3 people get. He stopped. He swallowed. Carol is gone. I was trying to get her in the car and she wasn't Carol anymore. She was biting me. I heard that word, biting, and my brain filed it in the wrong drawer initially. Like he was describing an animal attack, a dog, something with teeth that wasn't his wife. Then I looked at his neck again, and at the left arm still folded against his chest, and I understood what I was looking at, and it was different from how I'd been looking at it 30 seconds ago. How many people? I asked. I was already inside the professional thinking. That's the thing. 11 years of training, and the professional brain kicked in about 2 seconds after the personal brain finished being horrified. How far does it spread from here? Have you seen any patterns in who it's affecting? Walt looked at me for a moment like this was a strange set of questions given the circumstances. Then he said, I've been running for about 20 minutes. From our street to yours. I saw maybe 8, 10 people who were wrong. Not counting Carol. And 2 other people running. One of them I didn't recognize. One of them was the coaster kid, the teenage one. They went that way. He pointed south. I don't know patterns. I know that the people who were wrong, they were walking toward sounds. If I stayed still and quiet, they'd walk past me. They weren't looking, they were listening. That detail went directly into the part of my brain that processes threat information. And it sat there, and it meant something. And it took me until later, much later, to fully understand why. Okay, I said. Okay, Walt, do you have somewhere you can go? Is there anyone? I have a brother in Whitfield, 40 minutes out. He said it like he'd already calculated this, like he'd been calculating it on the walk over. I'm going to try to get to my car. Wait until I can. Kevin. He said my name flat and definite. The way you say something when you need the other person to understand that there isn't time to negotiate. Take your family and go somewhere safe. Don't try to wait it out here. Something is coming apart, and it's coming apart faster than it looks. Then he turned and walked off my porch and down the driveway and into the dark street. I stood in my doorway for maybe 3 seconds. It might have been less. Then I shut the door, locked it, and started moving. Here is what I learned in those first 20 minutes that I want to be honest about. Training doesn't eliminate panic. It channels it. My hands were not shaking, but they were cold, and my breathing was doing something wrong, and there was a continuous low-frequency noise happening somewhere in the back of my head, like a fan that won't quite turn off. But underneath that, the part of my brain that had spent 11 years building emergency response protocols was running a fast calculation that went something like this. Neighbor reports violent attacks within a quarter-mile radius. At least 8 to 10 people affected. Spread pattern unknown. Communication infrastructure potentially compromised. Timeline unknown. Threat appears to involve physical contact based on the nature of victims' injuries. Action required. Shelter in place or evacuate. I went upstairs. Diane was in the hallway. She'd heard everything through the bedroom door. I will say this about my wife. Diane is a middle school science teacher. She has the kind of patience that comes from spending 6 hours a day with 11-year-olds, which means she can hold a very large amount of unsettling information and wait for more before she reacts. She looked at my face and she said, "How bad?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but we're leaving now. How much time do we have?" "I don't know that either." She nodded once. That was the whole conversation. She went to wake Abby, and I went to wake Owen, and within 4 minutes, we were all in the hallway dressed in whatever we'd grabbed. Owen in his pajamas and sneakers, Abby in jeans and a hoodie, Diane with a coat over her sleep shirt. I went to the kitchen first, and did a fast sweep that I will be honest was more panic-informed than plan-informed. I grabbed the big canvas tote we use for farmer's market and stuffed it. Water bottles, whatever canned food was visible on the shelves. the bread that was on the counter, opened the medicine cabinet in the downstairs bathroom, and swept everything into a sandwich bag: prescriptions, Tylenol, a half-finished bottle of ibuprofen, bandages, the thermometer, car keys, my work bag with my laptop, and, more importantly, the printed maps I always kept in the outer pocket, because I was old-fashioned about maps. Owen wanted to know where we were going. I told him we were going on a night trip. He's 9, and at 9 years old you can still make things sound like adventures if you use the right tone. So I kept my voice flat and casual, and matter-of-fact, like this was a thing we'd planned. He asked if he could bring his Lego astronaut. I said yes. Abby was already on her phone. I didn't stop her. Yet. We got to the garage. I did a stupid thing here that cost us 4 minutes that I'm not proud of. I went back inside for my emergency kit. I have an emergency kit in my basement. I'm an emergency planner. Of course I have an emergency kit, but it was in the back of a storage shelf behind a box of holiday decorations, and it took me too long to reach it, and Diane was in the car, with the engine running and the garage door open, which in hindsight was not ideal, because a running engine in an open garage at 2 in the morning is loud, and if Walt was right about the attracted to sound thing, that was a liability. But I got the kit, which had flashlights and a hand crank radio, and a first aid kit that was actually stocked, and 2 liters of emergency water and space blankets, and a multi-tool. Worth it, probably. Still feel bad about the 4 minutes. We backed out of the garage. I want to describe our street at 2:25 a.m. that night, because the description matters. Briarwood Court is a cul-de-sac with 11 houses on it, and it had looked the same for the 8 years we'd lived there. Quiet, a little too many decorative mailboxes, good trees, the Hendersons' boat trailer in the driveway, 2 streetlights that worked and 1 that didn't. At 2:25 in the morning, it looked like a street where everyone was asleep. Except, at the far end of the cul-de-sac, in front of what I was pretty sure was the Neffs' house, the family with the twin boys and the aggressive golden retriever, there was a figure standing in the middle of the road. Just standing there, not moving, not doing the things a person normally does when they're standing in the street at 2 a.m., looking at a phone, waiting for something, any contextual activity, just standing, facing roughly our direction. Owen asked what that person was doing. I said I didn't know, and pulled out of the cul-de-sac in the other direction. We took Briarwood Lane to Oak Hill, and took Oak Hill north toward the commercial district. It was slow going in the dark. I had my headlights on, but I was watching the sides of the road more than the road itself, looking for movement. And I kept pulling my speed back down from what it wanted to be, because headlights and engine noise on empty streets were already 2 things working against us, and I didn't want to add speed through intersections to the list. On Oak Hill, near the elementary school, we saw 2 more of them, different from the one at the end of our street. These ones were moving. Not fast, not running. They had that walk that I didn't have words for yet, that walk that I'd come to recognize over the following weeks as being distinct from any human walk I'd seen before. Not a stumble, not a stagger, not anything you'd see from a drunk person. More like a walk with all the unnecessary motion stripped out. No arm swing, no head movement, just legs, moving forward, in the direction of, I couldn't tell what. There wasn't anything obvious. Maybe a sound from further up the street that I wasn't close enough to hear. Diane saw them the same moment I did. She didn't make a sound. Owen was looking at his Lego astronaut. Abby was looking at her phone, and I said, "Put it away," without explaining why, and she started to argue. And I said, "Abby, not right now," in the voice I don't use very often, and she put it away. We drove past them. They didn't turn toward the car. I was doing maybe 15 miles an hour past them, and the engine noise should have drawn a response, and they didn't turn at all. I don't know why. I've thought about this since, and I don't know if it was the specific sound frequency, or if they needed to be closer to respond, or if there's something else going on that I never figured out. But they didn't turn. I took a breath. I kept driving. The Briarwood Community Center was about 1.5 miles from our house, on the far end of the commercial strip near the library. I'd chosen it before we left. Didn't explain the choice to Diane yet, just drove there. Because of 3 things. It was a large building, with good structural bones, and multiple exits that I knew from having used it for emergency exercises. It had a backup generator, because we'd funded it through the county emergency preparedness grant 3 years ago. I know, there's an irony there. And it had a storage room with emergency supplies that I had personally stocked and inventoried in the spring. I also chose it because it was in a direction that took us away from where Walt had come from, and I was trying to get some distance between my family and whatever was happening in the south end of the neighborhood. The parking lot was empty when we pulled in. The building was dark except for the security light above the main entrance. I parked close to the door and told everyone to stay in the car while I checked. Diane gave me the look she gives me when I say something that she's going to agree to, but finds insufficiently thought through. I took the emergency kit and my multi-tool and went to the front door. The lock was a standard push-bar commercial door with a keyed exterior that I happened to have a key for because of my position. I got it open in about 30 seconds. The inside was dark and smelled like every community center at night. Floor cleaner and folding chairs, and the faint ghost of whatever the last event had been, probably the Tuesday bingo night. I stood in the entrance and listened and heard nothing, and went back to get my family. Owen asked if this was the night trip. I said yes, this was it. He said it wasn't very exciting. I said it would get more exciting later. That turned out to be accurate. The first thing I did once everyone was inside with the door locked behind us was find the supply closet. It was exactly where I'd left it, which sounds obvious, but I'd had a low-grade anxiety in the car that I was going to get there and find the lock changed or the supplies gone or the building renovated into something else. It was still there. I hadn't inventoried it since April, but most of it was still there. 2 cases of emergency water pouches, a flat of assorted canned goods, a box of protein bars that I was less sure about the expiration on, a hand crank radio, 2 large flashlights, a first aid kit, a box of N95 masks, left over from a county health preparedness order, 2 wool emergency blankets, a roll of duct tape, rope. Not a lot, but it was something. It was the difference between having a base and not having one. Diane organized the kids in the main meeting room while I went through the building to check what else was there. This is one of the things I'd practiced on paper, environmental assessment, which sounds bureaucratic and is very practical. What you're doing is building a mental model of your space, entry and exit points, internal structure, what you can see from which windows, where power is, where water is, where the vulnerable points are. I'd done this at a desk before with floor plans. Doing it in the dark with a flashlight at 3 in the morning is a different experience, but the underlying skill is the same. Building summary. 1 main entrance at the front, double doors, push-bar commercial, good solid frame. A secondary exit in the back through the kitchen, which was also a push-bar door and led to the parking lot. 3 windows in the main meeting room, ground level, which were a concern. A bathroom with 2 small high windows that were less of a concern. An office with 1 window, also ground level. An upstairs that I hadn't been in, accessible by a staircase at the back. I went up and found a storage space with more folding chairs and some sports equipment from a kids program, and 2 large windows that looked out over the parking lot and the street. Those upstairs windows were good. They gave you a view. Kitchen had running water. I turned on a tap and let it run for a moment. Water pressure was normal. I didn't know how long that would stay true. I found a landline phone on the kitchen wall. I picked it up and got a dial tone, which surprised me. Cell service on my phone was spotty. I'd checked in the car and gotten 1 bar, but the landline was working. I called 911. It rang 11 times. Nobody answered. I called the county non-emergency number, which I had memorized from years of calling it. That one rang 8 times, and then clicked to an automated message that said this line was experiencing high call volume, and to stay on the line, or call back at a later time. I stayed on the line for about 4 minutes. No one answered. I hung up. I called my office line, got voicemail. I tried my supervisor's cell, went to voicemail. I called the county emergency management director's office line, voicemail. That was the moment. Not Walt on the porch, not the figures on Oak Hill, but standing in the kitchen of the Briarwood Community Center at 3 in the morning, listening to nobody answer, when I understood in a physical way that this was not a small problem. You can dismiss one thing. You can rationalize two things. But no one answers in emergency management at 3 in the morning only when every person who is supposed to answer is either overwhelmed or gone. And both of those options meant something much bigger than what I'd been letting myself think it was. I went back to my family. Owen had fallen asleep on 2 pushed-together folding chairs. Abby was awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at nothing in particular. Diane had laid out the space blankets as a kind of makeshift sleeping area and was sitting on the edge of it watching me walk back in. I said, "I can't get through to anyone." She said, "Okay." That one word, just the one flat word, told me more about how Diane was processing this situation than anything she could have said at length. She was not panicking. She was not in denial. She was already somewhere past that, doing the same calculation I was. And the word "okay" was not an expression of acceptance, so much as an acknowledgement that we were now past the phase where outside help was something we could rely on. We sat for a moment in the dark. Then I said, "I have some supplies here. Water, food, first aid. We can be here for a day or 2, maybe 3 if we're careful. But I need to understand what's happening outside before I decide what to do next." Diane said, "The radio." I said yes. The hand-crank radio in the emergency kit picked up 3 AM stations and 2 FM stations. One of the AM stations was running regular programming, country music, automated, no disc jockey, which told you nothing about whether anyone was at the station. The second AM station was also running automated programming, classical music. The third was CRB, which was the county's designated emergency broadcast station, the one that all our protocols said to tune to in a major event. CRB was playing automated music as well. But between songs, there was an emergency alert system message playing on a loop that said, "Authorities are investigating reports of violent disturbances in several neighborhoods in the greater Briar County area. Residents are advised to shelter in place until further information is available." This message will repeat. It was repeating every 3 minutes. This was, I knew, the kind of message that gets broadcast when an incident has reached a certain threshold, but the incident is not yet defined well enough to say something more specific. The people who write these messages, and I know because I've helped write these messages, are trying not to cause panic while acknowledging that something is happening. The words "violent disturbances" and "several neighborhoods" told me 2 things. First, it had spread beyond my immediate street. Second, whoever wrote that message in the last few hours had been trying very hard not to say what was actually happening. I said to Diane, "I need to go outside and look." She said, "I know." She didn't tell me not to. She also didn't tell me to be careful, because there are times when telling someone to be careful is a way of managing your own anxiety, rather than offering anything useful. She just said, "I know," and handed me the good flashlight. I went out the back door into the parking lot. The night was cold. Colder than I'd expected, that October cold that gets into your hands fast. And quiet, in the way nights near a commercial strip are normally not quiet. No traffic noise, no distant sirens, which honestly was the most alarming absence of sound. My whole life, city nights have had distant sirens as their baseline. They're so constant that you stop hearing them, the same way you stop hearing your refrigerator. The absence was as specific as a noise. I went to the edge of the parking lot, where a low decorative fence separated it from the street. Oak Street ran in both directions from here. To the south, about 100 yards down, something was on fire. Not a building, more like a car, I thought, or something in a driveway. The light from it was orange, and it pulsed the way fire pulses. To the north, nothing visible. To the east, the library parking lot and the far edge of the commercial strip. I watched the south for about 3 minutes. I saw 2 figures moving past the fire. They walked through the light, and I got a clear look. One of them was wearing a bathrobe. Not the kind of thing you want to see a person wearing at 3 a.m. while walking toward a burning car with no apparent awareness of the fire or the heat or anything around them. I went back inside. I found a legal pad and a pen in the office and I sat down and started writing. Not journaling. I'm not a journaler. What I was doing was the thing I'd done at a desk 100 times, which was writing down what I knew and what I didn't know, and separating those columns carefully, because the worst decisions in emergency response come from treating unknowns as knowns. I'd taught this in a training seminar. I was now doing it at 3 a.m. by flashlight with my family asleep 20 feet away. What I knew: violent behavior affecting an unknown but expanding number of people in my area. Those affected appeared disoriented, drawn to sound, not visually responsive. Physical contact capable of transferring the condition based on Walt's injuries. Communication infrastructure either overloaded or compromised. No official response visible. What I didn't know: how many people were affected, whether this was chemical, biological, some combination, whether the emergency infrastructure would come back online, how fast it was spreading, whether daylight would change anything. What I needed: more information before making any decisions about where to move. I went upstairs and looked out the upstairs windows at the street and the parking lot, and I stood there for a long time listening. I heard the fire in the south, still burning, no louder. I heard something that might have been a voice from a long way off, a scream cut short. I heard, at one point, movement in the parking lot below me, and I went very still. It was a dog. A lab, I thought, though it was hard to tell in the dark. It trotted across the parking lot and paused at the edge, and sniffed at something and went away. I went back downstairs. It was almost 4. I sat in the office and made myself write the next section of the list. The next section was, what do we do from here? And I wrote and crossed out and rewrote until I had something like an answer. By the time the sky started going gray around 6, 5 other people had found the community center. First was a woman named Bonnie Aldrich, who was 71 and had lived 2 blocks from the community center for 30 years, and apparently walked there on pure navigational memory when her neighborhood got too loud. She arrived at the front door around 4:30, knocking politely like she had an appointment, and Diane let her in. Bonnie was wearing her nightgown under a winter coat, and she was carrying a tote bag containing a Reader's Digest, a bottle of arthritis medication, a portable phone charger, and, mysteriously, a full sleeve of Oreos. She sat down at one of the folding tables and said, "Well, I thought I'd come here." She did not say why she'd thought that, but it turned out to be a good instinct. The second arrival was a young man named Eric Cassidy, who was maybe 25, and who came through the back door at 5 a.m., which meant he'd jumped the parking lot fence or come through the service access. He was a stocky guy in a delivery driver jacket, and he was not injured, but he was breathing hard, and his eyes were doing the wide held open thing that eyes do when adrenaline has been running too long. He sat down on the kitchen floor and didn't say anything for about 4 minutes. Then he said, "They're all over the South End." He was from a neighborhood about 2 miles from here. He'd been running since 1 a.m. Around 5:30, a couple arrived, Pete and Lynn Garrity, mid-50s, who owned a restaurant called Garrity's down the street. They'd been at the restaurant doing overnight prep. Pete had insomnia and sometimes went in to cook at 4 a.m., and Lynn came with him sometimes. And she had been there when things started going wrong. They had a car. More importantly, they had a car that was partly loaded with restaurant supplies because Pete had been doing an inventory transfer and hadn't unloaded it. They had, in the back of their Subaru Outback, 3 large bags of flour, 2 industrial-sized cans of tomatoes, 20 pounds of dry pasta, a case of cooking oil, a flat of canned beans, salt, sugar, and a full set of commercial kitchen utensils, including a very useful 8-inch chef's knife. Pete was the kind of person who smelled like garlic at 5:30 in the morning and thought this was fine, and he immediately went into the kitchen and started figuring out what he could do with what was there. The 5th arrival was a man named Doug Prentice. He showed up at 6:15, just as the light was coming up enough to see by, and he knocked on the front door, and Bonnie went to answer it before I could stop her, and I came out of the office to find Bonnie saying, come in," to a large man in a Home Depot vest. Doug was tall, maybe 6'2", and broad, with a face that was usually friendly-looking, I imagined. But at 6:15, after whatever he'd been through, it was not looking its best. He had a scratch on his right forearm that he was holding a dish towel over. He said he'd come from 3 neighborhoods east of here. He said he'd cut his arm on a fence getting over it. He sat down at the table next to Bonnie, and she offered him an Oreo, and he took it. I looked at the scratch on his arm. It wasn't deep. The dish towel was barely stained. A fence scratch, possibly. Consistent with what he said. I couldn't tell more than that. I filed it and kept moving. At 8 a.m., the power went out. We still had the generator, but the main grid going down was significant for reasons beyond just the lights. It meant the infrastructure supporting the emergency alert system broadcasts was no longer guaranteed. It meant the water pressure in the building might eventually drop, because municipal pumping stations need power, and most of them have limited backup. It meant cell towers, most of which had 8 to 12-hour battery backups, were on borrowed time. I got everyone into the main meeting room, and I gave what I will charitably call a situation briefing that was probably less reassuring than I intended it to be. I laid out what we knew and what we didn't. I explained the supplies we had. I explained the generator and the fuel. A 20-gallon tank, which was less than I'd hoped. I said we needed to make decisions about how long we stayed here and what we did about bringing more people in. That last point generated some conversation that surprised me in how quickly it got sharp edges. Pete Garrity said, "We can't just keep opening the door to whoever shows up." I said we couldn't just not. He said, "That's how you end up with 50 people and no food." Bonnie said, "That's how you stay human." Pete and Bonnie looked at each other across the folding table with the particular expression of 2 people who have just discovered they are going to find each other very annoying. Eric Cassidy said, "How long are we going to be here? Does anyone actually know how big this is?" I said I didn't know the size yet. He said, "Well, when are you going to know?" It was a fair question. I said, "As soon as I have more information." I said it the way I'd said it in conference rooms and in training seminars, and I realized as I said it that it had the same hollow quality it always had, the quality of someone buying time by substituting process for answer. Diane was watching me from the edge of the room. She had that look she gets when she's reserving judgment. I went to the office and turned on the hand crank radio and turned through the frequencies slowly. CROB had changed its message. The new message said, "State and county emergency management agencies are coordinating a response to incidents of civil disturbance across the county. Law enforcement and emergency medical personnel are currently deployed. Residents are advised to remain indoors and await further instruction. If you are experiencing a medical emergency, please call 911. If you are unable to reach emergency services, please remain calm and shelter in your home." The phrase, "incidents of civil disturbance," told me that the framing was still trying to keep this inside a normal category. Civil disturbance means people fighting, rioting, mob behavior. It's a legal term as much as a descriptive one. Using it meant either that whoever was still running the emergency broadcast genuinely didn't know what this was, or they knew, and they were choosing their words very carefully. Either way, the phrase "remain in your home" was not useful information for 7 people who were currently not in their homes. I found a different station, a commercial FM out of the city, about 40 miles from here, that was not running automated programming. A live voice. A man who sounded like he was reading off a piece of paper in a hurry said that reports of violence had been confirmed in at least 3 counties, that authorities were describing the situation as under investigation, and then he said something that I wrote down immediately in my legal pad because it struck me as specific enough to be meaningful. He said, "A source within the county health department who asked not to be identified said the incidents share a biological vector, but that a cause has not been confirmed." Again, a biological vector. We're trying to get more information, and we'll update as it becomes available. Biological vector. That's a public health term. It means something in the environment that carries and transmits a pathogen. A mosquito, a water source, a person. Using it meant someone in the county health department, probably someone who'd been in a meeting in the last 12 hours, was talking to a radio station and using the specific technical language of disease transmission, which meant that however this had started, it had started in a way that resembled disease. I sat with that for a moment. Then I went back to the main room and told them what I'd heard, word for word. I've learned that the instinct to soften information in a crisis is understandable, but usually counterproductive. People need to know what you know so they can make reasonable decisions. The alternative, managing information, giving people the version you think they can handle, is something you do with children, and even then, it mostly doesn't work. Pete asked what a biological vector meant. I said it meant it spread like an infection. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the room in general. Who here came in contact with anyone? Anyone who was affected? Nobody said anything right away. Then Doug Prentice said, I touched a door handle that someone else had touched, maybe. I don't know. Eric Cassidy said, I ran past a bunch of them. Nobody touched me, Pete said. So we don't know. We did not know. That was correct. I said, let's move on. We need to talk about what we're doing next. 2 more people came in that morning. A retired firefighter named Carl Bridger, 66, with a thick gray beard and the specific calm of someone who has been in buildings on fire and is therefore not going to panic in a community center. He'd walked 3 miles. He had a pack with him that contained his own supplies, which told you something about Carl. He assessed the building in about 5 minutes without being asked, noted that the back fence had a gap in it that was a liability, and asked if anyone had done a perimeter check on the parking lot. I said I had, last night, but not this morning. He said he'd do it. The second was a teenage girl, maybe 15, who arrived alone. She came through the back door at around 10 in the morning and stood in the kitchen doorway with a completely blank expression and didn't say anything for a while. Abby went and sat with her. Because Abby is 14, and 14-year-olds sometimes understand things about other 14-year-olds that adults do not. The girl's name was Tess Halverson. She lived about a mile away. She didn't say much about how she'd gotten here or what she'd seen, but she had some cuts on her hands from what looked like broken glass, and she let Diane clean them without making any protest. We were 9 people now, in a building that held 300 when configured for events. We had enough food for maybe 4 days if we were careful, enough water for 3. The generator had enough fuel for roughly 18 hours if we ran it in shifts. I sat in the office and I looked at my maps. The maps were the reason I'd grabbed my work bag. I had 4 printed maps in the outer pocket, standard practice for emergency planners, because you cannot count on digital anything in a major event. One was a county road map, the full county, all the major and secondary roads. One was a FEMA flood risk map that I'd been using for a different project, but that also had useful topographic information. One was a utility infrastructure map showing power and water distribution lines. And one was something I'd printed maybe 2 years ago for an emergency shelter survey I'd done. A detailed map of county properties with emergency use designations, including the one I was looking at now. The map marked the Ridgeline Fire Lookout. It was a Forest Service structure, built in 1948 on top of Callaway Ridge, about 22 miles from where I was sitting. I had surveyed it 2 years ago as part of a rural emergency shelter inventory, one of those projects you do in government that feels bureaucratic and purposeless until the precise moment it becomes relevant. The lookout was a 12 by 12 cab on a 40-foot steel tower, accessed by a staircase, with windows on all 4 sides, and an attached ground-level structure that had been added in the 90s as a weather station. It had a hand pump well on the property, a propane tank that I'd noted as being 70% full at the time of my survey, and an emergency radio transmitter that could receive Forest Service and NOAA weather frequencies. It also had 4 walls and a lockable door, and sat at an elevation of about 2,000 feet on a ridge, with one access road, which was a gravel Forest Service road off a county highway. It was not a perfect shelter. It was 22 miles away, and the roads between here and there were not straightforward. But it had things that a community center in the middle of a suburban commercial strip did not have: water, fuel, elevation, radio, and exactly one way in and out. I had a copy of the key on my key ring. I'd had it for 2 years and had never removed it, because I'd never had a reason to. I didn't say anything to anyone about the lookout yet. I wasn't ready to say anything, because I wasn't ready to say we were leaving. There was still part of me that was waiting for the official response to materialize. The fire trucks and ambulances and National Guard Humvees that should have been rolling by now in any properly functioning emergency response. The part of me that had spent 11 years building response frameworks was still listening for them. They did not come. On the second day at the community center, 4 things happened that shifted everything. The first, the cell towers started going out. Not all at once. One by one over the course of the morning, coverage dropped from spotty to non-existent for most of us. Abby's phone was the last to lose signal, probably because she was on a different carrier, and she lost it around 11 a.m. She came and told me with the specific quiet tone of a teenager who is trying very hard not to be frightened and is not quite succeeding. The second, we ran out of generator fuel at 2 in the afternoon. Carl had been running it in shifts, as I'd said, but 18 hours at intermittent use turns out to be less than 48 hours in real time, and we hit the bottom of the tank during what would have been a reasonable window. No power meant no lights, which was manageable during the day. No power meant the refrigerator in the kitchen, which Pete had been using to store some temperature-sensitive items, was no longer reliable. No power meant the building's heating system, which was forced air electric, went off. October nights in this part of the state get into the 30s. That was a problem we'd have by tonight. The third thing, a group of people showed up in the parking lot around 3 in the afternoon. Not infected people, regular people. A group of maybe 11, including some children, who had walked from a neighborhood about a mile east and were looking for somewhere to shelter. Carl had been keeping watch from the upstairs window and came to get me. I went up and looked. The group had brought things with them. Backpacks, a wheeled suitcase, what appeared to be a box of supplies. They were moving quickly, but not frantically. There was an adult man at the front who was waving in our direction, having apparently spotted the cars in the parking lot. I went down and conferred with Pete and Diane and Carl. Pete's position had not changed since yesterday morning. Diane's position was that we had room and we had food, and these were people with children. Carl said the structural question for him was less about supplies and more about whether we could secure this building for 11 additional people and whether any of them were presenting symptoms. I said if we were going to keep saying no to everyone who showed up, we'd already made our decision about who we were going to be in this situation, and that was a decision we should make explicitly rather than implicitly. We let them in. That brought us to 20 people. The man from the front of the group was named Dale Whitmore, and he was a high school history teacher with a beard and a calm, authoritative manner that made people organize themselves around him without being quite sure why. He had his wife, 2 teenage sons, and a collection of neighbors he'd gathered on the way. He came in and assessed the room and introduced himself and said, "What's the situation here? What do we know?" I brought him up to date on what we knew, which took less time than you'd think, because the honest answer was, not much. He said, "We saw a crew of them, the infected ones, whatever they are, in a parking lot about half a mile back. About 20 of them, clustered together. They weren't fighting. They weren't doing anything. They were just standing there." I asked him what they were standing near. He said a Walmart loading dock, but they weren't trying to get in or anything, just standing. I said, "Which direction were they facing?" He thought about it. "Toward the street, the main road." I said, "Were there sounds from the main road?" He said, "Traffic, a few cars going by." Facing the traffic, responsive to sound. 20 of them clustered together, not by any kind of coordination that I could see, just a convergence of individual attention toward the same noise source. I wrote that down. The fourth thing happened at around 4:30, and this one I did not put in my notes immediately because I needed to think about it first. Doug Prentice had been quiet all day, not unusually quiet. He was a quiet person generally, from what I could see. But around 4:30 I went to the kitchen for water, and he was in there alone, sitting at the small kitchen table, and he was looking at his right forearm where the scratch was. He didn't notice me at first. He was just sitting and looking at it, with the expression of a person who has found something on their body that they did not expect to find. The scratch was inflamed. Not badly, not dramatically, but the skin around it had that slight raised redness that isn't the normal redness of healing. It was warm-looking, the kind of thing you might not notice at a glance, but that catches your eye when you know what you're looking for. Doug saw me looking and pulled his sleeve down. He said, "It's fine." I said, "Okay." He said, "It's just from the fence. It's healing." I said, "Okay." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, and then he said, "I told you where I got it." I said, "I know." Neither of us said anything else. I got my water and went back to the main room. I found Carl and told him quietly. I said, "Keep an eye on Doug Prentice. Not obviously, just keep an eye on him." Carl looked at me steadily. He didn't ask why. He said, "Already noticed." That night, our second night at the community center, no heat, everyone bundled in whatever they had. I pulled out the county road map and spread it on the office floor and sat cross-legged looking at it with a flashlight. 22 miles to Callaway Ridge on a route that had at least 3 road options, none of them great. Option 1, straight shot on Route 14 north to County Road 7, then 7 west to the Forest Service Road, the fastest route. About 22 miles of mostly paved road. The problems: Route 14 ran through 2 small commercial areas where I'd expect to find both abandoned vehicles blocking the road and potentially large numbers of infected people attracted to whatever residual sounds came from those areas. Option 2, a longer route that went east on Oak Street, picked up the township road system, and snaked north through a mostly rural corridor to intersect with County Road 7 further west. 31 miles, mostly paved but 2-lane county roads, avoided the commercial areas. This was my preference. Option 3, a combination route that I'd have to improvise based on conditions, using the road map and the topographic information from the FEMA flood map. The immediate question was not route selection. The immediate question was, do we leave? I made a list of the reasons to stay. We had shelter. We had a known location. If official response materialized, they'd come to population centers. We had relative safety right now. I made a list of the reasons to go. No heat and dropping temperatures. Limited water. City water pressure had dropped noticeably in the last 4 hours, telling me the pumping stations were failing. Limited food for 20 people. The building was in a commercial district that was probably the highest risk area for infected concentration. The lack of any official response in 48 hours. I didn't finish the 2 lists because I didn't need to finish them. The second list was longer, and each item on it was getting worse with time, not better. I folded the map and put it in my jacket pocket and went to find Diane. She was in the main room with Owen, who had managed to sleep through the night on a cot one of Dale's neighbors had brought. Abby was awake, sitting with Tess in the corner, both of them talking quietly in the specific way of teenagers who have found that they are going through the same thing. I said to Diane, "I think we need to move, tomorrow morning." She said, "Where?" I told her about the lookout. I explained what it had, what it didn't have. I explained the route. I explained that we had enough vehicles now. Pete and Lynn had the Subaru. Dale had a minivan that held 8. I had my car, and Carl had a truck, to move 20 people in 3 trips or fewer. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "Have you told everyone else yet?" I said no. She said, "Tell them tonight. Let people decide." I said, "We can't leave people behind." She said, "I know, but you should let them decide." She was right. That was the difference between a decision that people own and a decision that happens to them. And in a situation where everything else was out of people's control, that difference was the only autonomy anyone had left. I told everyone that night. We gathered in the main room, all 20 of us, and I explained the lookout. I explained the route. I explained what we had there and what we'd be giving up by leaving here. I said my assessment was that we needed to move, and I gave my reasons, and then I stopped talking and let people talk. There were about 40 minutes of conversation, some of it productive, and some of it the kind of circular anxiety processing that happens in groups under stress. Pete Garrity had concerns about the route. Carl Bridger said the building's heating situation was going to be a medical risk by the end of the week, without better cold weather preparation. Dale Whitmore's wife asked about the kids, meaning was the route safe for children, and I said I didn't know for certain, but that my plan was to avoid areas of known concentration. Bonnie Aldrich said she'd go wherever the group went, and didn't see why everyone was making this harder than it was. Doug Prentice said nothing. He sat in the back of the room and watched. In the end, 17 people said they were going. 3 of Dale's neighbors, a couple and an older man who lived alone, said they were going to try to reach family in the next town over. I told them I understood, and I gave them a copy of the county road map from my bag, the one I'd been using, because I figured they needed it more than we did. I gave them one of the flashlights from the supply closet. The older man, whose name was Robert, had a car. He shook my hand before they left the next morning and said thank you, in a way that made it clear he was thanking me for something specific, though I wasn't sure what. I told Carl about Doug Prentice privately before we went to sleep. Not what to do about it. I didn't know what to do about it, but what I'd seen. Carl listened and said, "I'll stay close." I lay awake for a long time that night. I was thinking about the route, and I was thinking about 20 people, and I was thinking about the logistics of loading vehicles, and what we'd take and what we'd leave. But underneath all that practical thinking, there was something else, something that didn't have a place in the logistics column. I was thinking about Walt Purcell. I was thinking about how he'd stood on my porch and not come inside, how he'd held his arm, how he'd been bitten by his wife, and he'd known enough about what that meant to step back from my door, to not accept my invitation to come in, to say his piece and go. I was thinking about what Walt knew, or suspected, in that moment. And I was thinking about Doug Prentice and the inflamed scratch and the expression on his face in the kitchen. And I was putting those two thoughts side by side, and they were making a picture I didn't want to look at directly. I fell asleep eventually. I don't know what time. In the morning, Doug Prentice did not wake up on his own. He was in the meeting room, on the far end, and when I went through at 6:30 to start organizing the departure, he was still on his cot, and he was breathing in a way that was wrong. Not labored, not the kind of wrong breathing that sounds like struggle, more like a breathing that had become autonomous, in a way breathing should already be, but usually isn't. Like the voluntary and involuntary parts had come apart from each other. I stopped at his cot. His eyes were closed. His arm was outside the blanket, and I could see the scratch even from standing distance. It was much more inflamed than last night. The skin around it had gone dark at the edges, in the way infected tissue does. Carl was beside me, without me hearing him arrive. He'd been watching from across the room. He said, quietly, "How long does it take?" I said, "I don't know. I've seen no data on that." Doug's eyes opened. For a fraction of a second, less than that, a fraction of a fraction, they were Doug's eyes. I know that sounds like the kind of thing you say retroactively to make a story more meaningful, but it's what I saw. There was something in there for just a moment, and then it wasn't there anymore. His eyes went to that particular quality I'd started associating with the affected people. Not vacant, not empty, but oriented, alert in a different direction. He sat up. Carl and I moved. I called out, not loudly but firmly, "Everyone out, now, other room, now," and I moved people away from Doug's corner. People started moving without knowing why, and then they understood why when they saw Doug, who was on his feet now, standing by his cot, not looking at any of us. His head was turned slightly, angled. He was listening. The back door was open. Someone had gone out earlier. The sound of outside, birds, distant noise, was coming in. His head tracked toward it. He walked toward the back door, around people, not through them, not going after anyone, not looking at anyone, just moving toward the open door and the sounds outside, and people moved out of his path, not because he was threatening them, but because every instinct in the room said to let this man through. He went out the back door. We stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of his footsteps on the gravel, growing fainter. Bonnie Aldrich had her hand over her mouth. Tess was standing next to Abby with her arms crossed very tightly. Pete Garrity was very still. Lynn had her hand on Pete's arm. Owen was in the main room. He hadn't seen any of it. He was eating a protein bar with the focused attention of a 9-year-old. I said, "We leave in 30 minutes. Nobody argued about the route anymore. Loading the vehicles took longer than 30 minutes, because things always do. We moved quickly, and we moved deliberately, and we did not panic, which I will count as an accomplishment given what had just happened in the kitchen. Carl organized the loading. I organized the supply division. Diane organized the people. Dale and his family handled their own vehicle and coordinated with us. Pete and Lynn loaded the restaurant supplies into the Subaru first. 48 minutes after I said 30 minutes, we were out of the parking lot in convoy. 3 vehicles. Pete and Lynn's Subaru at the front, Dale's minivan in the middle with his family, and Bonnie and Tess. My car at the back with Diane and the kids. Carl was in his truck, which was the 3rd vehicle, and I'd asked him to take the back position because his truck was the largest, and if something was blocking the road ahead of him, he had more ability to push through or go around. We went east on Oak Street first, then north on Township Road 4. This took us away from the commercial strip and immediately into a residential zone that was quieter than what we'd been looking at from the community center windows. Not untouched. I saw 2 cars in a ditch on Township Road, one of them with the engine still running, and there was a house on the left side of the road about a mile in that was burning steadily from the inside, fully involved, with nobody near it. But quiet, in the sense that we didn't have to stop. The road was passable. I had the county map on my lap and Diane was following it as I drove. She'd done this with me before on camping trips. She reads the map, I drive, and we have an arrangement about who's allowed to say, "I thought you said turn left back there," and when. She called every turn clearly, and I took them, and we stayed with the convoy. About 4 miles north of the community center, the road changed. It got narrower, and the trees came in closer on both sides. County forest land, mostly mixed hardwood, the kind of trees that drop their leaves all at once in October and carpet the road in wet orange and brown. The convoy slowed to maybe 15 miles an hour because the leaves on the road were slippery, and the narrowing made the sightlines worse. But it also meant we were away from the neighborhoods, and the farther away from the neighborhoods, the better I felt. Owen asked where we were going. I said we were going to a tower on a hill. He said, was it like a castle? I said, kind of. Yes. He seemed satisfied with this. We hit the first problem 12 miles out. Township Road 4 dead-ended at a T intersection with County Road 12, and County Road 12 was blocked. Not by infected people, by vehicles. A pile of them, actually. 6 or 7 cars and a pickup truck all piled together at an angle that suggested they'd stopped suddenly, and others had run into them, or someone had deliberately arranged them, or both. I couldn't tell which. They completely blocked the road in both directions far enough that we couldn't go around on the shoulder without going through a ditch and possibly losing a vehicle. Pete's Subaru stopped at the pile. We all stopped. I got out to look. The vehicles were abandoned. No one in them that I could see. One car had its driver's door open. Another had its windshield cracked from the inside out. Not shattered completely, just a long spiderweb fracture from an impact point on the interior side. I didn't look at that too closely. More importantly, on the far side of the pile, maybe 100 yards down County Road 12 going east, there was a group of infected, maybe 8 of them. They were doing the standing still thing, the facing a sound source thing. There was a car alarm going off somewhere in that direction. I could hear it now that I was standing still, faint but regular, the kind that runs in a cycle. They were facing it, standing in the road about 100 yards away, facing east, not moving. I went back to my car and looked at the map. If we couldn't go east on County Road 12, we had a problem, because the route to the Forest Service Road went east on 12 and then north. Going west on 12 would take us further from where we needed to be, and the next parallel road going north was a township road that I was less sure about. I said quietly to Diane, "We can go west on 12 about 2 miles, and there's a road that goes north. It's a gravel road. It adds maybe 6 or 7 miles to the trip. She said, I said, or I move a couple of these vehicles and we go through. She said, with those people 100 yards away. I said, the car alarm is going to keep them occupied. She said, you don't know how long that alarm has been going. She was right. A car alarm that had been running for hours might be about to stop, and if it stopped while I was moving vehicles, we'd have 8 infected people's attention, plus the engine noise from our convoy, plus no time to deal with it. I said, let's go west. We went west. The 6-mile detour took 20 minutes on a road that was in poor shape, even before the world fell apart, and Carl's truck took a pothole hard enough that we all heard it, and he slowed to check for damage, which took another few minutes. The gravel road going north was rough, but passable. We got back to something like our route eventually. The second problem was more complicated. About 17 miles from the community center, with roughly 5 to go, we came around a bend in County Road 7 and saw the gas station. It was a small independent station, a 2-pump place with a little store attached, the kind that exists at rural intersections. The pumps were dark, no power, but there was a light on inside the store, a real light, not a candle, which meant someone there had power, or a generator. There were 2 trucks and an SUV in the lot. A man was standing outside the door. He was armed, a rifle across his chest, not pointing at us, but held ready. Pete's Subaru slowed and stopped about 50 yards out. I stopped behind him. Carl stopped behind me. The man watching us was maybe 40, wearing a hunting vest and a ball cap. He didn't move toward us. He stood still and watched. I said to Diane, stay here. She said, Kevin. I said, lock the doors when I get out. Open them when I come back. I got out. I walked toward the man with my hands clearly visible, not in the raised hands gesture, which would have been weird, just with them out in front of me a bit. No threat in how I was holding them. He said, when I was about 20 feet out, stop there. I stopped. I said, we're just trying to get north. We're not looking for trouble. He said, there's no getting fuel. Pumps are down. I said, we don't need fuel. We just came around the bend and saw you and stopped. We'll move on. He said, where are you going? I said, Callaway Ridge. Something moved in his face. Not hostility. Something more like recognition. He said, how many of you? I said, 17. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, hold on. He went inside. I stood in the road for about 3 minutes. Then he came back out with a second person. A woman, also armed, younger, with her hair pulled back. The man said, we've been at this station 2 days. We have 12 people inside. We have fuel, not for the pumps, but in cans. We have food from the store. He paused. We heard shooting from the south side of the county this morning. A lot of it, more than you'd expect. I said, what does that tell you? He said, tells me someone is still trying to fight their way through it down there. I said, and that's not working. He said, not from how it sounds. I said, we're going to Callaway Ridge. There's a lookout there. Forest Service structure, with supplies and a radio. It's up on a ridge with 1 access road. If you want to follow us there, you can follow us there. If you'd rather stay here, I understand that too. He looked at the woman. She looked back. One of those conversations that happens in a look. He said, let me talk to the people inside. I said, take your time. He went back in. I stood in the cold at the edge of the gas station parking lot and thought about what the shooting from the south side meant, and tried not to let my face show what I was thinking. He came back out in about 5 minutes. 7 of the 12 will come. The other 5 are staying. I said, okay, do you have vehicles enough for 7? We have the 2 trucks. I said, good. Follow Carl's truck at the back. His name is Carl. He'll lead you in if we get separated. The man's name was Ryan Coaster. He was 41, same age as me, and he'd been a county highway maintenance crew supervisor before all this, which meant he knew these back roads the way I knew emergency protocols, practically hands-on, in real conditions. That turned out to matter. We added 7 more people and 2 trucks to our convoy. The last 5 miles were the slowest. Not because of infected people, though we saw them. 3 individuals, spread out, on different sections of the road, each one separately absorbed in whatever sound had drawn it. We slowed past them and kept our windows up and our noise minimal, and none of them turned toward us with any speed. One started to turn toward the sound of our engines as we passed, but we were already by it before anything happened. The slowness came from the road itself. The Forest Service access road that led up to Callaway Ridge was a single-lane gravel road that switched back 3 times up the ridge and had not been maintained well even before the world fell apart. October rain had softened the shoulder, and there were places where the road narrowed to barely the width of Carl's truck, and you could look off the right side and see a significant drop into hardwood forest below. Pete's Subaru scraped its undercarriage on a rock at the first switchback. Ryan's trucks handled the road better. They were built for it. Dale's minivan had the worst time of it, fishtailing slightly on the gravel twice, and I could see Dale's knuckles from behind him, going pale when we went past the second switchback. But we made it. All of us. The lookout came into view as we came around the top of the ridge. First the tower itself, 40 feet of steel latticework with the cab on top, and then the small ground-level structure beside it, and then the full view of what was around us, which was the ridge running in both directions, forested, and below it in all directions the valley and the county and the distance. I parked and got out. The air up here was different from the valley, colder, sharper. The trees had lost most of their leaves, and you could see through them. The sky was overcast but not raining. From where I was standing, I could see maybe 10 miles in the direction of the town we'd come from. And what I could see was the town and the smoke over it. Not a single fire, not a localized thing, but a kind of dispersed haze that sat over the whole area, the accumulated product of a lot of things burning. Owen came and stood next to me. He looked at the view. He looked at the tower. He said, "Dad, it's not like a castle." I said, "No." He said, "It's better than a castle. You can see everything." I put my arm around him and held it there. He let me. The lookout structure, the ground level one, not the tower, was a 14 by 18 prefab metal building that the Forest Service had added in 1994. It had a door with a padlock, which I opened with the key I'd been carrying for 2 years. Inside, a folding cot, a metal cabinet with emergency supplies, flares, rope, basic first aid items, a small propane stove that worked off the large propane tank outside, a shelf of miscellanea left by various Forest Service workers over the years, a logbook, and the radio unit mounted on a shelf above the cot. The radio unit was an old NOAA and Forest Service receiver, the kind that picks up weather frequencies and emergency broadcasts. It had a hand-crank generator of its own that was separate from the propane tank. I cranked it for 3 minutes and turned it on. Static across most frequencies. 2 channels with the automated NOAA weather broadcast, which was still running off automated systems. On the Forest Service emergency frequency, a hiss that occasionally broke into something almost coherent before going back to hiss. On the emergency broadcast frequency, the FEMA ES frequency, I found something. It was not the message from Crebre with the shelter-in-place instruction. It was a different message, read by a different voice, and it was the voice that made me pay close attention before I'd even processed the words. Because the voice had a specific quality to it, not panic, not the controlled neutral of a public announcement reader, but the quality of someone who was reading something they understood completely and was choosing their words from a script rather than improvising. I knew that quality. I'd heard it in trainings. It was the voice of the CONPLAN messaging system, the Continuity of Operations Plan Communication Protocol that Federal Emergency Management uses when the situation has escalated beyond the state level. The message said, in part, Person 4, Presidential Emergency Directive, all county and municipal emergency management personnel are advised to activate Level 4 shelter protocols. All non-essential movement in affected counties is to be suspended. The primary containment zone encompasses the following counties: and here it listed 9 counties, including mine. And secondary containment observation areas have been designated in adjacent zones. Federal response teams have been activated and are being deployed. Do not attempt to access the primary containment zone perimeter. Emergency communication will continue on this frequency as conditions allow. Level 4 Shelter Protocol. I taught Level 4 to county emergency managers at an annual conference 3 years ago. I had the slide deck still on my work laptop somewhere. Level 4 meant you were no longer talking about local response. Level 4 meant the federal government had made a determination that the situation could not be controlled by state and local means, and that the policy objective had shifted from response to containment. Containment. Not resolution, not treatment. Containment. The perimeter. I turned the radio down and sat with that word for a long time. The perimeter meant they were drawing a line around us, not to help us, to stop the spread beyond us. And the instruction, do not attempt to access the primary containment zone perimeter, was not directed at infected people. It was directed at people like me. They were telling the unaffected people inside the zone not to try to leave. I thought about that for a while. Then I went back outside, to where everyone was gathering their things from the vehicles and setting up a rough camp in the clearing around the base of the tower. The sun was dropping toward the ridge to the west, and it was getting cold fast. Diane had found the propane stove and was heating water. Ryan and his people were making quick work of setting up what they had. Carl was doing the thing Carl always did, which was assess the perimeter and the access road without being asked. I found Diane. I said, I need to tell you what I heard on the radio. She said, how bad? I said, the government has designated a containment zone. We're in it. She was filling a pot with water from the hand pump. She pumped it twice more before she set the pot down and looked at me. She said, what does that mean, practically? I said, it means someone with authority over these things has decided that trying to help everyone inside this zone is not the priority right now. The priority is making sure whatever this is doesn't spread beyond it. She said, so they've written us off. I didn't answer that immediately, because the honest answer was, I didn't know yet. There was a difference between being written off and being deprioritized. There was a difference between a containment zone you maintained indefinitely and one you maintained while you developed a response. I'd worked in emergency management long enough to know that the gap between we're containing this and we're developing a plan to help the people inside was either very large or very small, depending on what was actually happening at the federal level, and I had no way to know which it was, from 22 miles north of the county seat on the top of a ridge. What I said was, I don't know, but I know we made the right call coming here. She looked at me, with the particular expression that is reserved, between us, for moments when she thinks I'm right, but doesn't want to give me too much credit for it. It's a very specific look. I've been watching for it for 16 years. She said, you need to tell everyone. I said, I know. I told everyone that evening, around the fire we'd built in the clearing. Carl had found a fire ring already there, probably used by Forest Service workers on off days. The containment zone message, what it meant, what it didn't necessarily mean. People reacted in different ways. Some people were quiet. One of Ryan's group, a man named Frank, got angry in the hot, frustrated way of someone who's been afraid for days, and anger is easier to carry than fear. Dale asked logistical questions about supply chains and how long containment designations typically lasted. Bonnie Aldrich ate her second-to-last Oreo. Then Pete Garrity, who had been quiet through all of this, said something I've thought about many times since. He said, are we going to try to get out? I said, I don't know yet. He said, what are we waiting for? I said, information. I want to understand what we're dealing with before I decide whether going toward the perimeter is better than staying here. He said, you're an emergency planner. That's what you do. You make decisions with incomplete information. He was right. I said so. I said, give me 48 hours to understand what's on that radio. Then we'll make the decision. He nodded. It was an enthusiastic agreement. It was the kind of agreement you give when you've stated your position and you're going to hold someone to their word about the timeline. The first morning at the lookout, I climbed the tower. 40 feet of steel lattice staircase, open to the air, with the ridge wind going right through it. Cold enough that my hands were stiff on the railing before I was halfway up. The cab at the top was a 12 by 12 room, with windows on all 4 sides. Old windows, double hung, some of them stuck, but 4 of them operable. Inside, a wooden shelf, a small desk bolted to the wall, a stool, a firefinder map board that was several years outdated, but still showed the topography. Binoculars hanging on a hook that I was very glad to find. I stood at each window in turn with the binoculars and looked out. The view from up here was better than I'd imagined even knowing the elevation. To the south, the county we'd come from, the town, the smoke haze, and with the binoculars I could see movement in the valley below on the main road, but couldn't resolve it well enough to identify. Just movement, cars, or people, or both. To the north, the ridge continued and then dropped into a different valley, one that contained a cluster of farm buildings and what looked like intact infrastructure. No obvious fire damage, no obvious mass movement. To the east, more forest, and about 8 miles out what might have been another ridge road, harder to see through the tree coverage. To the west, the ridge itself, running another mile and then dropping to a lower saddle, and beyond that, another mountain. Directly below me, around the base of the tower, our camp. 17 people plus 7 more, and 2 trucks and the Subaru and my car and Dale's minivan, and a fire in the ring, and the propane stove with something on it. From here they looked very small against the size of the ridge and the forest and the distance. I spent an hour up there. I took mental notes on everything I could see. I found myself paying particular attention to the North Valley, the one with the farms, because it looked undisturbed, and because if we needed to expand our food resources, that valley was where we'd look. I came down and ate breakfast, which was beans heated on the propane stove with some of the pasta from Pete's restaurant supplies. Pete had cooked it. It was, genuinely, much better than beans needed to be given the circumstances, and I said so. And he said, "I can't not cook it right. It goes against something in me." After breakfast, I went to the radio and spent 3 hours working through frequencies. The Forest Service band had intermittent traffic, not the automated message, but actual voice communications, broken and often impossible to decode cleanly through the static. But there, people talking, coordinates, status reports, the word perimeter again, in context I couldn't fully understand. A number, and I wrote this down, 7 miles, in reference to something I couldn't identify. On a civilian frequency I found a woman who was broadcasting what I can only describe as a survivor's bulletin. She gave a location, a town about 40 miles northeast of us, outside the containment zone as I understood it, and she listed resources there, names of people who'd arrived safely, and she said her name was Helen, and she was transmitting at the same time each day on the same frequency, and if anyone heard her to respond. I responded. She heard me. The signal was weak and we lost each other twice in the conversation, but I got across that we were at Callaway Ridge with roughly 24 people, and she got across that her settlement had about 60 people, a working water system, and a contact with someone outside the zone perimeter. That last part, someone outside the perimeter, I asked her to repeat it. She said it again, a contact, a person who was in regular communication with her from the other side of the containment line, who was providing information. I asked what kind of information. The signal broke up for a while. When it came back, she said, "He told us that the zone is going to be lifted in sectors, that there's a process, that it's not permanent." I sat with that for a minute, listening to the static. "When?" I said. More static. Then, "He doesn't know exactly, but he said the thing they're afraid of is people moving. If people move, the model breaks. They need people to stay where they are." I said, "Where did you hear this?" She said, "I know him. He works in..." The signal broke. I lost her for 2 minutes. When she came back, I got the word federal, and something before it that might have been formerly, and something after it that I couldn't hear at all. I said, "Can you reach him today? Can you ask him about Bryer County specifically?" She said she'd try. She said same time tomorrow. I turned off the radio to save the hand crank battery and sat in the small ground-level structure, looking at the logbook that previous Forest Service workers had kept. It went back 9 years. Entries about weather, about fires spotted, about equipment maintenance. Normal stuff, routine stuff, the kind of thing that accumulated in any institutional record. The last entry was from about 2 months ago. Someone named T. Halloran, Forest Service fire observer, checking in after a shift. Noted. No fire activity. Equipment in good order. Water pump working. Signed out. T. Halloran had no idea, 2 months ago, that this logbook's next entry would be made by someone in very different circumstances. I picked up the pen. I wrote the date. I wrote, 24 survivors. Callaway Ridge Lookout. Day 3. Radio contact established, with settlement to the northeast. Containment zone confirmed. Perimeter status unknown. Supplies for approximately 10 to 12 days at current consumption. Will update. Then I added, assessment. The tower gives us sight lines. The ridge gives us defensible position. The road gives us one way in and one way out, which is both the best and worst thing about being here. I put the pen down. Outside, I could hear the camp starting to come awake more fully. Voices, movement, the sound of the water pump going, a kid laughing. One of Dale's kids, I thought, or Ryan's group had a child I hadn't met yet. The morning was cold and clear, and the wind up here was constant, the kind of wind that doesn't stop, just breathes different from minute to minute. I went outside. We settled into something like a routine over the next several days, which I know sounds strange. Routine, in this situation. But it's what humans do. You find the shape of the days and you fill them in. Mornings, fire, breakfast from whatever Pete was working with, radio time. I spent an hour every morning and an hour every evening on the radio, rotating through frequencies, building a map in my head of what was happening beyond Callaway Ridge. Afternoons, practical work. We inventoried everything we had from all 4 vehicles, and all the bags and packs people had brought and assigned it to categories. Food got sorted and rationed. Pete managed this with the precision of a man who had portioned restaurant supplies for 30 years and was applying the same skills to a different kind of kitchen. Water from the hand pump was reliable, but needed to be treated and stored, and Carl rigged a system using the containers from my emergency kit and some jugs Ryan's people had brought. Shelter. The metal structure held about 8 people at a stretch, which was not enough for 24, so the others organized in the vehicles with the engines off and blankets, or built a secondary shelter from a tarp Ryan had and some Forest Service rope I found in the cabinet. The tower I reserved for watch shifts, 2-hour shifts, 2 people at a time, rotating through the adults. From the tower you could see the access road in both directions for about a quarter mile before it curved. You could see the clearing. You could see movement coming up the ridge from below, though not far enough to give much warning. Maybe 5 to 7 minutes, if something was coming up the road at walking pace. In the evenings we gathered around the fire and people talked. About what had been home. About people they didn't know were okay. About what they thought was going to happen next. The conversations around that fire in the evenings were some of the most honest conversations I'd had in my adult life, which is maybe the only thing you can say in favor of the situation. When everything else is stripped away, people stop performing and start saying actual things. Bonnie Aldrich talked about her late husband and the trip they'd always wanted to take to Scotland, and how she'd always thought there'd be more time. Ryan said almost nothing about himself, but would listen to others with a complete, focused attention that made people feel heard. Dale was an unexpectedly good storyteller. He'd been a history teacher for 20 years, and he had the ability to put things in context in a way that somehow made the current situation feel less unprecedented than it was. Humans have survived worse, he'd say. Not as empty comfort, but as actual historical argument. And then he'd give you the argument. Tess, the teenager who'd arrived alone on the second day at the community center, was quieter in the evenings than she'd been when Abby was around during the day. There was something going on with her that I couldn't fully see, but that Abby could, apparently. Because Abby spent a lot of her non-watch shift time with Tess, in a way that I recognized as deliberate. My daughter was not a naturally empathetic person in the surface sense. She was too direct, too honest, sometimes abrupt. But she had this quality of being actually present with people, actually paying attention, and it turned out that was worth more than a softer personality in this context. I was proud of her for it, in the quiet way you're proud of your kids when they do something good and you don't know how to say it right. Owen had taken to the tower in the way that 9-year-olds take to anything high up and slightly dangerous. Carl supervised him for the first 2 trips up, and then cleared him to go up with an adult anytime he wanted. And after that, Owen went up several times a day, reporting back on what he'd seen with the meticulous observation of a child who has decided this is his job. He was, in fact, a decent observer, better than some of the adults. On the 4th day, he came down from the tower and found me at the radio and said, "Dad, there are lights in the valley." I said, "Where in the valley? North Valley?" He said, "Yeah, but it's weird." I said, "What's weird about it?" He said, "They're moving, but not like cars, not fast enough for cars. And they're in a line, kind of, but the line changes shape." I went up the tower. He was right. In the North Valley, about 8 miles out, there were lights. Not many, 3, maybe 4. And they were moving slowly, and they were in a rough arrangement that was changing as I watched. I had the binoculars, and in the fading evening light, I couldn't see enough detail to understand what I was looking at. People with flashlights, an organized search team. The lights had a quality to them that wasn't quite right for flashlights. They were a bit too steady, not bobbing the way a handheld light bobs with walking. More like lights mounted on something that moved on its own. I watched for about 20 minutes. Then the lights went behind a tree line, and I didn't see them again that evening. I went down and told Carl. He went up and looked at where I'd said, and then came back and said, "Could be a group moving through with headlamps on poles, or helmet mounted. Some of Ryan's people used something like that for the drive up." I said, "Ryan's people are here." He said, "I know." We looked at each other for a moment. He said, "Military survey teams sometimes use that configuration. Night survey equipment, infrared." I said, "Why would a military survey team be in the North Valley?" He said, "I can't think of a reason that's particularly comforting." I found Ryan and told him what we'd seen. He went up the tower himself and looked, and came back and said, "I've seen that configuration before. I did a stint in the Army Reserve about 15 years ago. That looks like it could be a reconnaissance pattern. The shape changing. That's how you cover ground. Like a sweep." I said, "Sweeping for what?" He said, "Can't tell from here." I went to the radio and called Helen on her frequency. She wasn't on. It was past her transmission window by an hour. I left a brief message, knowing she might not get it. "We've seen lights in the North Valley, moving in a pattern. Can you find out anything about what's in that area?" Next morning, she was on the frequency, her signal clearer than it had been. She said, "My contact responded. He said there are federal teams inside the containment zone, assessment teams. He said they're not rescue. He said they're—" She paused, the pause of someone who's deciding whether to say what they've been told. "Mapping. They're mapping survivor concentrations." I said, "Why?" She said, "He didn't fully explain, but he used the phrase extraction priority, like they're deciding who comes out first." Extraction priority. The phrase sat in my chest in an uncomfortable way. I said, "Does he know about us? Our location?" She said, "I told him. He said Callaway Ridge is in the northern quadrant, which is lower priority than the population centers." I said, "Lower priority." She said, "He said lower priority doesn't mean no priority. He said everything inside the zone is being assessed. He said the timeline is static, weeks probably, not months. He said if you can stay where you are and stay healthy, you stay there." I said, "And if we can't?" Longer pause. Then, he said make your way to the northern edge of the zone. There are collection points. He'll try to get me the exact coordinates. I said, "Thank you, Helen." She said, "Stay warm up there." It sounds cold. It was cold. She was right about that. The thing I hadn't told anyone about yet, not even Diane, was the survey markings. I'd found them on the third day while doing a perimeter walk around the base of the tower. On the north face of one of the large oak trees about 60 yards from the structure, at roughly chest height, there was a mark. Not a natural mark, a deliberate one, cut into the bark with something sharp, a straight line with a smaller diagonal line crossing it. The cuts were old. Not ancient, not decades, but definitely weathered, definitely more than a few years. Below that mark, maybe 20 feet away, there was another mark on a different tree. Same symbol. I followed the line they suggested, and found a third mark, and a fourth, and then the line of marks stopped, or turned, and I found where it turned, and followed it, and it went up the ridge toward a rock outcrop I hadn't been to yet. I went up to the rock outcrop alone the next morning. The outcrop was a natural flat shelf of sandstone, about 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep, jutting out from the ridge face, with a view to the north that was even better than the tower's north-facing view. Below and around it, the trees came up close, which meant it wasn't visible from below unless you knew where to look. On the face of the rock, at the back edge of the shelf, were more marks, not the tree bark kind. These were inscribed directly into the sandstone, and they were different, more complex. A series of lines and angles that didn't match anything I recognized as a standard survey symbol. I photographed them with my phone, knowing the photos might not be useful for a long time, given the lack of connectivity. Below the inscribed marks, someone had left things, not recently. The items were weathered in the way of things that have been outside for years. A glass jar with a rubber-sealed lid, inside of which was a folded piece of paper, a piece of cord, tied in a pattern I didn't recognize, looped around a piece of wood about 8 inches long, 3 small stones arranged in a triangle. I opened the jar carefully. The paper inside was dry, the seal had held. I unfolded it. It was handwritten. The handwriting was small and very precise, the handwriting of someone who wrote carefully and meant every word. It said, "If you're reading this, you've found the upper cache. The lower cache is accessible by following the north marks from this point approximately 300 yards. It has what you need for extended stay on the ridge. Good water source 20 feet below the north face, accessible by the cut trail. If you do not know me, know that this place has been prepared for a time of need. If you know me, tell the others the location. Trust the process. WH. WH. I stood on the rock shelf with the paper in my hand and the view north in front of me, and I tried to make sense of what someone had prepared, in advance, on this ridge. Not government. The Forest Service's ground-level building was down at the clearing. This was something else. Someone had been here, years ago, and had left a cache, and had written a note that assumed a reader who needed it. The lower cache, 300 yards north along the marks, turned out to be a covered pit, about 4 feet deep, lined with plastic sheeting, and covered with a wooden platform that had been covered with dirt and leaves, and took me 15 minutes of careful probing to find. Inside the plastic lining, 10 sealed gallon containers of what the labels said were freeze-dried food stores, 6 sealed containers of clean water, a box of emergency medical supplies that was much more comprehensive than what I'd found in the Forest Service cabinet, and a hand-cranked radio that was significantly more powerful than the one in the lookout structure, a multi-band unit that could transmit as well as receive. I sat at the edge of the pit and looked at all of this. Someone, WH, had built this cache years ago, had been preparing, had expected at some level that at some point someone would be on this ridge and would need exactly this. I thought about the initials, the writing style, the knowledge of this specific location, and I thought about the Forest Service logbook in the ground-level structure, with its 9 years of entries, and the last entry 2 months ago from T. Halloran, and the entry 2 years before that from W. Halloran, and 3 years before that, also W. Halloran. W. Halloran. WH. This was someone who had worked this tower, who had come here, probably many times, and had quietly, without anyone knowing, built something out here for a reason they'd apparently never needed to explain, because the reason was self-evident if you ended up here. I carried as much as I could back in 2 trips. I didn't tell everyone where I'd found it right away. I needed to think about the communication. In the end, I brought it all back to the camp and said I'd found a cache on the ridge, which was true, and that someone had stalked it, which was also true. And I let people ask their questions and answered what I could. The multi-band radio I kept in the lookout structure and started working through it that night. The food and medical supplies I handed over to Pete and Diane respectively. Pete looked at the freeze-dried food containers and said, with genuine feeling, "This is going to change things." I said yes. He said, "Who put this here?" I said, "Someone who was thinking ahead." He looked at me. He knew I was choosing what to say, and he accepted it. On the 5th day, Owen spotted movement on the access road. I was in the tower when he called up. He was at the base of the tower and he called up to me, "Dad, someone's coming." I turned the binoculars to the access road. One person, walking, coming up the switchbacks from below, visible through the gaps in the trees as they went around each bend. They were walking at a normal pace, a human pace, not the wrong pace. They had a pack. They were walking in the middle of the road, and they weren't doing the head angle thing that I'd learned to read as indicating infection. I called down, "Get Carl, don't make any noise." Carl came up. He looked. He said, "Alone?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Coming straight up the road, not hiding." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Watch them come in. When they're within earshot, I'll come down and talk to them." We watched the figure come up the last switchback and into the clearing. She was a woman. I could see that now. Maybe 50, with a pack that was well organized in the way of someone who'd been carrying it for a while. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked around at the camp and the vehicles and the people who had all gone quiet and were looking at her. She said, in a carrying voice, "My name is Nadia Rourke. I'm not infected. I found this place on a paper map. I've been walking for 3 days. I came down from the tower." She was about 52, 53, with gray in her dark hair and a calm face that had clearly been through 3 days of hard walking. She had hiking boots and a rain shell and the kind of pack that people who go on serious hiking trips use, with the frame and the sternum strap. She also had, hanging from the top loop of the pack, a compass that I recognized as a high-quality military-grade baseplate compass, not a toy. I said, "How did you hear about this place?" She said, "I didn't hear about it. I found it on the map. I was looking for high ground with a road, and this was the highest point on the county map, with an access road." She paused. "Is that a lookout tower?" I said yes. She said, "Good. I know how to use a firefinder." She was quiet for a moment. "I worked for the Forest Service for about 12 years before I moved into GIS mapping work. I know lookout towers." I said, "Who do you know in the Forest Service? Anyone based at this tower?" She said, "Years ago, I worked with a few people here. In passing, there was a guy named Halloran, first name Walter, I think, who worked this tower for a long time. Very methodical, quiet type. Walter Halloran, W.H. I said, "Did he ever talk to you about this ridge? About preparations he'd made here?" She looked at me steadily. Then she said, "You found the cache?" I said yes. She said, "Then you know enough." Walter wasn't crazy. He wasn't a prepper in the way that word gets used. He was a person who understood that this particular ridge, in this particular geography, was a naturally defensible position, with good water and good sight lines and one road. He was thinking long-term, the way the Forest Service thinks long-term about fire management. Decades, not years. I said, "Is he still alive?" She said, "I don't know. I haven't been able to reach anyone I knew from those years. The communication breakdown has been," she paused, "thorough." I said, "Come in, eat something." She came in. Nadia's addition to our group was disproportionate to her being one person. She had skills that complemented what we already had. 12 years of Forest Service fieldwork, which meant she understood land management, water systems, and ridge survival in a practical way. She also had a detailed knowledge of the county's geographic structure that came from years of GIS mapping. She knew which valleys drained which way, which roads were maintained and which weren't, where the ground went soft in wet weather, where the natural passages through the terrain were. She also had information. She'd been walking from about 15 miles southeast of us, from a farm where she'd been sheltering for the first 2 days. The farm family was still there. She'd left with their blessing, looking for something with better sight lines and better communication capacity. She said the area around the farm was heavily affected, lots of infected in the surrounding region, but that the farm itself was intact and the family was managing. She'd passed through affected areas to get here, and she'd done it by moving at night and staying off roads. She also told me something about the movement patterns of the infected that added to what I knew. She said, "They're not random. I've watched them enough now to see it. Each one, individually, is responding to sound, but groups of them, over time, they start to cluster near things that make consistent noise. Not random noise, consistent noise. Machinery that runs, traffic patterns, generators." I said, "We have a generator." She said, "You should run it only when you have to, and not at night. Night is when the sound carries furthest up here. During the day, the wind covers more." I said, "Have any of them come up the ridge?" She said, "Not that I've seen. The grade is significant. They move, but they don't problem solve. Going uphill on a switchback road, the sound sources in the valley are closer, louder. I think they stay in the valley because that's where the sound is." I said, "What happens if the valley goes quiet?" She said, "Then you'd have to think about that." I thought about it. The valley going quiet meant the natural sound attractants, traffic, machinery, generators in the neighborhood we'd left, had stopped. How long before a valley's ambient noise level dropped enough that the ridge became more attractive? I didn't know. Nadia didn't know. I added it to the list of things to monitor. On day 7, Ryan came to me with something. He said, "I want to talk to you about something I've been thinking about." We walked to the rock outcrop. I'd shown it to the group the previous day, and sat on the flat shelf with the valley view, and he said, "The 7 people who came with me from the gas station, and your family, and the others. That's 25 people on this ridge. We have food for maybe another 10 days, optimistically, with the cache. Water is stable, but we're not growing food. We're not hunting. Nobody here has proper hunting equipment. We're consuming a finite stock." I said, "I know." He said, "The North Valley, the farm's down there. I've been watching it with the binoculars for 3 days. I can see 2 farm structures from the tower, intact. No obvious fire damage. And a field that still has late-season crop in it. Something. I can't tell exactly what. But it's still standing, and it's not been stripped." I said, "You want to go down there?" He said, "I want to send a small team. 2 people. Quietly. Day trip. See what's there." I said, "The lights we saw." He said, "Were 4 nights ago. I haven't seen them since." I said, "Doesn't mean they're gone." He said, "No, but it doesn't mean they're still there." I sat with the view of the North Valley for a while. Ryan was right that we needed to think past the current supply horizon. He was also right that the North Valley looked intact. He was also right that the lights might be gone, and might not mean what we'd feared, or anything at all. I said, "I'll go, with you." He said, "You should stay on the ridge." I said, "You know the trucks and the roads. I know the—" I searched for the right word. "I know how to look at a situation and read it systematically. We should both go." He thought about it. Then he said, "Tomorrow, early." I said, "Tomorrow." I told Diane that night. She sat with it for a moment and then said, "How far?" I said, "Maybe 3 miles down the north face. There's a Forest Service fire road on the other side of the ridge that connects to the North Valley Road. Nadia knows it." She said, "Take the radio." I said, "Handheld." "Yeah," she said, "and Carl's truck." I said, "We're going on foot." "The truck is too loud." She looked at me. I said, "Nadia is going to give us the route. We stay off the main roads. We go in, we assess the farms, we come back. 4 hours, maybe 5. She said, And if something happens? I said, then Carl is in charge of the ridge. He knows what to do. She said, Kevin. I said, yeah. She said, I know why you're going. I know it's the right call. I just needed to say that I know why. I understood what she meant. She meant that the reason I was going down into that valley wasn't just the food supply. And she knew that. And she was acknowledging it without making me say it. The real reason was the thing I'd been sitting with since the radio message. The containment zone. The extraction priority. The assessment teams with their moving lights. The knowledge that sitting on this ridge and waiting for someone to come for us was a strategy, and not necessarily the right one, and that at some point, I was going to have to decide whether to act on the information from Helen's contact or not. Going down to the North Valley was the first step in understanding what acting on that information would look like. She knew. She was saying she knew. I said, I'll be back before dark. She said, I know. Ryan and I left before first light. Nadia had walked us through the route the night before with the map, down the north face of the ridge on the fire road, which was steep and rough and about 1.5 miles of descent. Then east along a low path that paralleled a creek. Then north along the creek to where it opened into the valley proper. She estimated about 90 minutes of walking in. The ridge face in the dark was disorienting. We used headlamps on the lowest setting and kept close to the road edge because the drop on the downhill side was significant in places. We didn't talk more than we had to. Ryan moved well in the dark. He had the silent, economical movement of someone who'd spent time in places where noise mattered. At the bottom of the ridge, where the fire road met the low path, we paused. The valley at this hour was sounds, not threatening sounds, early morning sounds, the kind you forget exist. Birdsong starting up, wind in the remaining leaves. The creek, nearby, constant. Normal sounds. The sounds a valley makes when it's functioning the way valleys function. No human sounds. No mechanical sounds. No infected. We'd heard them from a distance before. That walking that didn't sound like walking. That directionless shuffle and stop pattern. And there was none of that here. We followed the creek north. The farms Nadia had seen from the tower were about 2 miles north along the creek. The land was flat here, which meant sight lines were limited. You couldn't see more than 100 yards in most directions because of the hedgerow plantings and the tree lines that divided the fields. Ryan and I went slowly and stopped often. At each stop, we listened for a full minute before moving again. The first farm we found was abandoned. Or not abandoned. The house looked intact. The barn looked intact. The fields were still there. But there was no one in it. The door of the farmhouse was closed and locked. The windows were intact. In the barn, there were tools hung neatly on their hooks, a tractor in one bay, hay in the loft. Whatever had happened here, it had not involved destruction. The people had either left or were inside and quiet. Ryan tried the farmhouse door. Locked. He knocked, not loudly. Nothing. We looked at the field. It was a late cornfield, not grain corn, the kind you could eat. Dry now, past its prime for eating, but still usable. The stalks were brown, and the husks were dry, and there were probably 500 or 600 ears still on the stalks. Ryan said he thought we could harvest it and dry it further and use it. We took what we could carry, both our packs, about 30 pounds total, and moved on. The second farm, another half-mile north, was different. There was smoke coming from the chimney. We stopped at the tree line about 200 yards from the farmhouse and watched for 10 minutes. The smoke was steady, a clean wood fire smoke. No movement visible. Then a door opened and a person came out. An older man, moving slowly, carrying a bucket to a water pump in the yard. He pumped water into the bucket. He carried it back inside. The door closed. Ryan and I looked at each other. I said, "One man, apparently, or at least one person visible." He said, "Could be more inside." I said, "Only one way to find out." We approached openly. We came out of the tree line into the clear and walked directly toward the house. About halfway across the field, the door opened again, and the old man appeared with something in his hand that turned out to be a very old shotgun. He said, "Stop right there." I said, we're not infected. We've come from Callaway Ridge, the lookout tower. We're not threatening anyone. He said, how many of you? I said, 2, just us. We have a group on the ridge, about 25 people. We came down to see what was in the valley. He said, what are you looking for? I said, food, information, contact with other people. He was quiet for a moment, looking at us across the distance. He said, how'd you get here without running into any of them? I said, we went along the creek. We went slow. He said, He lowered the shotgun slightly. Not all the way, but noticeably. He said, how long have you been on the ridge? I said, 7 days. He said, you got a radio up there? I said, yes. He said, I've been trying to reach the lookout on Forest Service band for a week. I said, we haven't been checking that frequency regularly. I'll start. He said, come inside. His name was Earl Dawson. He was 74 years old and he'd farmed this valley his entire life. He was alone. His wife had passed 3 years ago, his son was in another state and hadn't answered his phone in a week, and the neighboring farms were either empty or he hadn't heard from them. He'd been entirely alone in this house for the duration, managing his wood stove and his well pump, and watching the south end of the valley from his front porch. He gave us coffee, which I cannot tell you the impact of after 7 days on the ridge without coffee. Actual ground coffee from a percolator on the wood stove. I did not drink it fast enough to be impolite, but I wanted to. He told us what he'd seen in the valley. In the first 2 days, there had been a significant amount of movement through, from people coming out of the town. Some of them infected, some of them not. The uninfected ones he'd helped when he could, opened his barn for 2 nights for a family of 5 who passed through on foot, gave canned goods to 2 people he found on the road. After that, the traffic had thinned, and the last 3 days had been quiet. He said he'd seen the lights too, same nights we had. He said, military. I know those lights. Seen them before, different context, different years. They're doing ground assessment. I said, assessment of what? He said, don't know. But they went through twice and nobody came to my door, which tells you they either didn't see me or they saw me, and they're not coming back to this farm for a reason. I said, what reason would that be? He said, could be they're marking unaffected individuals for their list. Could be they're leaving certain areas alone for a tactical purpose. Could be neither. He refilled my coffee without asking. I worked at an airfield for 18 years doing ground maintenance. I know how military operations move when they don't want to be seen. These ones didn't want to be seen, but they also weren't specifically hiding. That's a certain kind of operation. That's a survey. He looked at me with the sharp, unclouded eyes of an old man who has had a long time to understand the difference between situations that are clear and situations that look clear. He said, you're the emergency planner. I said, how do you know that? He said, because you've been on that ridge for a week with 25 people, and nobody's dead, and you haven't panicked, and you came down here to look at farms, instead of waiting for someone to bring you food. He paused. And I heard your name on the radio, from that woman to the northeast. Helen something. She mentioned Briar County, and a Kevin Hartley at the lookout. Helen had used my name. Of course she had. I said, Earl, I'm going to tell you what I know, and what I think. He said, I'd appreciate that. I told him everything. The containment zone message, Helen's contact, and the extraction priority information, the assessment teams, what I was thinking about the timeline and the options. I laid it out the way I laid things out in conference rooms, clearly, completely, without softening the parts that were uncertain. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, what do you need from me? I said, your farm is a resource point. If we're going to sustain 25 people on that ridge past the next 10 days, we need to be able to come down here and collect supplies. Do you have enough to share? He said, I have 300 pounds of potatoes in the root cellar. Got a full garden that's still producing what the frost hasn't taken. Got 30 chickens, which means eggs. Got a pantry that I stock for winter like my parents taught me, which means more than most people would expect. He was quiet for a moment. If you've got 25 people who can work, I've got enough for all of us well past spring, if we manage it right. That word. Spring. Such a specific, forward-looking word. I said, "We'll come back, with more people. We'll help with the farm." He said, "Good. Before you go." He stood and went to a shelf and came back with a handheld radio, the old-style kind. Forest Service Frequency 7. "I've been trying that. Try it tonight if you can, and tell your people that the lights won't come back this week." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I know what time of the week military supply rotations happen, and those lights are moving on a supply rotation pattern. They'll be back in about 10 days, probably." He gave me this information the same way he gave me the coffee, as if it were an obvious thing that any reasonable person would do, hand something useful to someone who needed it. We carried the corn and a flat of canned goods from his pantry that he pressed on us, and walked back south along the creek in the early afternoon. The trip back up the ridge face was hard. Harder than I'd remembered on the way down, because the packs were heavier, and the grade that was steep going down was steeper going up. Ryan set a pace, and I matched it, and we didn't stop except to listen. The valley stayed quiet behind and below us. At the crest of the ridge, where the fire road met the top, we stopped and turned around and looked back down at the valley. Earl's farmhouse, 2 miles north, was a pale square in the brown and green of the valley floor. The smoke from his chimney was a thin thread going straight up in the still air. Ryan said, "He's alone down there." I said, "I know." He said, "Should we have?" I said, "He knows where we are. He knows the frequency. When he's ready, he'll come up, or ask us to come get him. He's not the kind of man you take somewhere he's not ready to go." Ryan looked at the farmhouse for another moment. Then he nodded and turned toward the ridge camp, and we started walking. That night I tried Forest Service Frequency 7 on the multi-band radio from Walter Halloran's cache. There was traffic. Not much, not clear, but there. Voices and what sounded like position reports, with coordinates I couldn't fully decode, but could tell were geographic. At one point, through heavy static, I heard a voice that said, "Briar County Northern Sector," and then a number I lost in the static. I couldn't make contact. The transmit function on the multi-band unit was working, but I didn't know if my signal was reaching anyone, and after 30 minutes of trying, I stopped. I sat in the dark in the ground-level structure with the radio off and the logbook open in front of me, and I wrote up the day. The farm, Earl, what he'd said about the lights, what I'd seen in the valley, the crop in the abandoned farm field, the chickens. I wrote it in the logbook, not because anyone needed an official record, but because the act of writing was the act of remembering, and I wanted this remembered clearly, not filtered through my imperfect recollection later. After I wrote it, I sat for a while. Outside, the camp was settling into the sounds it made at night. The low voice of someone on watch, a kid saying something half asleep in one of the vehicles, the wind in the trees. The fire in the ring had burned down to coals that threw no visible light but held heat. I thought about the word containment and what it meant from the inside. In emergency management, containment is a function of control. You contain something to prevent its spread, but the premise is that you understand what you're containing and you have the resources to maintain the perimeter. The moment either of those premises fails, containment becomes something else. It becomes abandonment in a frame. And the distance between those two things, containment as a managed strategy and containment as a rebranded abandonment, was exactly the distance I couldn't measure from here. I didn't know which one we were in. Helen's contact said weeks, not months. Earl seemed to think the military presence in the valley was a sign of ongoing activity, rather than a sign that someone had drawn a line and walked away. The radio traffic on Forest Service 7 was something, though I couldn't decode what. What I knew was simpler than all of that. I knew I had 25 people, plus Earl in the valley. I knew I had 10 days of guaranteed food and a farm 2 miles north that could extend that significantly if we could work it. I knew I had a radio that might eventually reach someone who could tell me more than I currently knew. I knew I had a road that went up and a road that went down, and decisions that had to be made eventually, about which direction to go. I knew that Diane was asleep in the car about 30 yards from where I was sitting, and Abby was on watch in the tower, and Owen was asleep with his Lego astronaut next to him in the back seat. I knew that was the whole of what I was responsible for, really. Not 25 people, not the county, not the emergency planning protocol I'd spent 11 years writing. Just those 2 kids, and the woman asleep in the car, and whatever it took to keep them whole until something else became possible. Everything else was the work I was doing in service of that. On day 9, Abby came to me with something. She'd been on the early morning watch. I'd added her to the rotation because she was 14 and capable, and because the alternative was leaving adults who'd been awake for long shifts on consecutive days. She came down from the tower at 6 and found me at the radio, and she said, "Dad, I need to tell you something I heard." I said, "Okay." She said, "I know you said not to use the phones because the battery matters and there's no signal. But Tess has a phone with a different SIM, and it's been picking up something. Not calls, like a ping, a data signal. It comes in the mornings for about 20 minutes and then goes away." I said, "Show me." Tess's phone was an older model with a secondary SIM that I didn't fully understand the configuration of. But Abby was right. In the morning light, with the antenna in a certain position, the phone was showing 1 bar of something. Not a standard cellular signal. The icon was different from what I recognized. Some kind of auxiliary data connection, possibly satellite-based. The kind that's sometimes embedded in older emergency communication systems. It wasn't a phone call, but it was data. Abby said, "I sent a text to Mom's work email. I don't know if it went through." I looked at her. The expression on her face was the particular mix of having done something without asking permission and knowing exactly why she'd done it. I said, "What did you say?" And she said, "I said we're at Callaway Ridge, Bryan County, 25 people. We're okay. We're asking for contact." I looked at the phone, at the 1 bar of mysterious data signal, already fading as the morning shifted. I said, "That was smart." She said, "I didn't know if I should." I said, "You did the right thing." She nodded once, the nod of a 14-year-old who was not looking for praise, but had needed to know if the judgment call was sound. The signal went to 0 a minute later. Whether the message had gone anywhere, I didn't know. Whether anyone on the other end was looking at that inbox, I didn't know. But someone now knew the words Callaway Ridge, Bryan County, 25 people, okay, contact. Those words were out in the world somewhere. Day 11. Pete had managed to establish a cooking rotation using the propane stove and the addition of Earl's canned goods and the corn from the abandoned farm, and the freeze-dried supplies from the cache meant that people were eating enough. Not well, not the kind of eating that feels like comfort, but functionally enough. Pete had found that you could rehydrate the freeze-dried food in creek water boiled on the stove and combine it with the corn, which he ground roughly with a flat rock, and make something that resembled a thick porridge that was not anyone's first choice, but was warm and filling. He'd also figured out how to make flatbread from the flour they'd brought from the restaurant without an oven, using the flat surface of the propane burner's heat shield as a griddle. He made it every morning. People gathered for it. It was the social event of the day. On day 11 it rained. A steady October rain that came in from the west and settled over the ridge for most of the day. The camp had made adaptations. The tarps Ryan's people had set up as a secondary shelter were extended to cover more area. The vehicles were repositioned to create windbreaks. Wood was brought under cover. Nadia supervised most of this, moving through the rain with the calm of someone who had spent years outdoors in all kinds of weather. I spent most of the rainy day at the radio. I'd established 3 consistent windows during which I reliably tried to reach Helen: morning, midday, evening. She was consistent too. She'd been at it twice a day since we'd first made contact. At midday she was weaker than usual. The weather was affecting the signal. But she got through enough to tell me that her contact had sent new information. The containment zone's northeastern sector, the sector she was in, outside the zone, was being used as a staging area for the extraction teams. She said he'd described coordinated relief operations beginning in the high-priority population centers within the zone, and that the timeline for the less populated northern areas was... She paused for a long time in the static, and I lost her, and she came back. Longer than first thought. Longer than first thought. I said, "What does longer mean?" She said, "He said weeks to months, not days to weeks. He said they're running into capacity problems at the collection points." Months. I said, "Has he received any communication about our location specifically?" She said, "He's looking. He hasn't found a direct reference." I said, "There may be one. We sent something 9 days ago. My daughter sent a text message to an email address on a data signal that appeared briefly. I don't know if it went through." She said she'd ask him to look. I sat with months for the rest of the rainy day. Months was a different calculation than weeks. Months meant winter. We were at 2,000 feet in October. Winter up here was not the same as winter in the valley. The ground-level structure was insulated only by its metal walls and whatever we stuffed in the gaps. The propane tank was going to run out, I estimated, in about 6 weeks at current usage. Months meant we needed to be sustainable, not just surviving. I called a full group meeting that evening, rain drumming on the tarps, everyone packed into the shelter, and the overflowing into the doorway. I went through it all, the updated timeline, what I thought it meant, what I thought we needed to do. I said, "We have 2 options. We stay on this ridge, and we make it sustainable for winter, which means more food, more fuel, better shelter, and a plan that gets us through March or April. Or we try to move toward the northeastern sector, which Helen's contact says is where the extraction operations are staging. That's about 40 miles from here, through territory we don't know, and through whatever is between here and there." I paused. I said, "I don't know which is right. I want everyone to know that. I'm the person with the most background in emergency planning in this group, and I can tell you that in 11 years of doing that job, the most dangerous thing I ever saw was people confusing process expertise for certainty. I know the process." "I don't know the outcome," Carl said. "What does your gut say?" I said, "My gut says we stay for now and move when we have better information. My professional brain says exactly the same thing." Pete said, "And if better information doesn't come?" I said, "Then we make the best decision we can with what we have, which is what we've been doing." Frank, the man from Ryan's group who'd been angry about the containment zone news, said, "What's our cutoff? If we're going to move, at what point do we decide we're going?" That was actually the best question anyone had asked. I said, 3 conditions. 1. We confirm the northeast staging area is real and reachable. 2. We have enough information about the route to make a reasonable plan. 3. Our supply situation here becomes untenable before extraction reaches us. He said, "And if those conditions never all come together?" I said, "Then we've built something sustainable here, and we stay." The room was quiet with the rain on the roof. Dale said, "I vote we stay for now." Ryan said, "Same." The rest followed, more or less. Not unanimous. Frank didn't vote, which was his way of saying he didn't agree, but was going along. But enough. I said, "Okay. Let's talk about winter prep." And we did. For 2 hours, we talked practically about what needed to happen before November. Carl had ideas about the shelter structure. Nadia had ideas about the water system. Ryan had ideas about firewood. Pete had ideas about the food. They were all good ideas. Real ideas, grounded in actual knowledge. I sat in the middle of it and took notes, and asked clarifying questions, and coordinated, which was, it turned out, what I was actually good at. Not being the hero, not having all the answers, coordinating. Making sure the right information got to the right person, so that the person with the knowledge could do the work. 11 years of emergency planning, and it turned out the most useful skill it had given me was knowing how to hold space for other people's expertise. Day 13. Clear after the rain. Cold. The first true cold. The kind that makes the air feel like a different substance. Ice on the puddles in the morning. Owen was fascinated by the ice, tapping it with his sneaker. watching the pattern crack. I climbed the tower in the morning, as I did every day. Binoculars, the routine assessment. Something in the North Valley had changed. Earl's farmhouse, still there, still showing chimney smoke. But the abandoned farm to the south of his, the one where we'd taken the corn, had something new outside the barn. A vehicle, a truck I hadn't seen there before. I held the binoculars very steady. It was a truck that was not from this farm. The color was different from the one in the barn, and it was parked at an angle that suggested arrival, not storage. Someone was at the abandoned farm. I went down and found Ryan and Nadia and told them. We watched the farm from the tower in shifts through the morning. At around 10, a person came out of the farmhouse, then another, then a third. They moved around the property with the specific movements of people who were inspecting it, looking at the well, checking the barn, going around the perimeter. At 11, one of them looked at the ridge. The binoculars were good enough that I could see the face clearly. A man in a dark jacket. He had binoculars of his own. He was looking at the ridge, at the tower. We were looking at each other through binoculars from 3 miles apart. After a moment, the man with the binoculars lowered them. He turned to the others. They talked briefly. Then they went back inside the farmhouse. An hour later, a truck started moving south out of the valley, on the main road that headed toward the town. I watched it go. Nadia, beside me in the tower, said, "They know we're here." I said, "Probably." She said, "The question is who they are." I said, "Yeah." She said, 3 people in a truck, inspecting a farm, moving during daylight, not infected, organized. I said, "Survivors. Possibly the assessment team, possibly someone else." She said, "How do you tell them apart?" I said, "You can't always, from a distance." She said, "What do you do?" I thought about it. I said, "You make yourself visible enough that if they're friendly, they can find you. And you make sure you can see them coming before they can see you well enough to cause trouble." She said, "We're already both of those things." I said, "Then we wait." We waited. 2 days later, someone came up the road. Not a single person this time. A vehicle. A truck. Not Carl's truck. Not Ryan's trucks. A different truck. Dark-colored, moving slowly up the switchbacks. Moving with deliberate caution, the same way we'd come up 9 days ago. It stopped at the edge of the clearing. Nobody got out immediately. The truck sat running for maybe 3 minutes. The engine sounded loud and the clearing quiet. Then the door opened and a man got out, hands visible, and he stood beside the truck and said, in a voice aimed at the camp in general, "My name is Ben Hargrove. I'm with a federal emergency response team. We received a text message from this location 9 days ago. We're here to make contact." Abby's text. I was in the doorway of the ground-level structure. I walked out. I said, "Kevin Hartley, Bryan County Emergency Planning." He looked at me. He was about 45, in a dark jacket without any visible insignia on it, with the particular posture of someone who has been doing field work in difficult conditions and has adapted to it. He said, "How many people?" I said, 25 here, 1 more in the valley." He said, "What are your conditions?" I said, "Functional. Food for 2 to 3 weeks. Water stable. No injured, no sick." He said, "Can we talk?" I said yes. He came inside. He told me, over the next 40 minutes, more than Helen's contact had been able to tell me. The extraction operations were real and ongoing. The Northeast Sector staging area was real. The timeline had shifted. His honest assessment was 6 to 10 weeks before organized extraction reached the northern areas of Bryan County, contingent on the situation in the population centers continuing to stabilize. He said stabilize in a particular way that I recognized as a euphemism covering something more complicated. He said the assessment teams were mapping unaffected survivor groups. We were now on that map. He said the perimeter was semi-permeable, not a hard barrier in the sense of physical infrastructure everywhere, but monitored. Individuals attempting to cross were being redirected to the collection points. He said, "If you can sustain here for 6 to 10 weeks, the recommendation is to stay. The route to the staging area is not simple. I said, we know the route is not simple. He said, I know you do. You drove through whatever it looked like down there 9 days ago. He had 2 boxes in the truck. He brought them in. Communication equipment. Specifically a compact satellite transmitter and a pre-programmed receiver unit that could reach the staging area directly. A medical kit that was significantly more comprehensive than anything we had. And a printed list of frequencies and protocols. He said, you'll have daily contact windows starting tomorrow morning. Any changes in your situation, report them. I said, what's on the other end of these frequencies? He said, coordination team at the staging area. They know about you now. They'll be tracking your group. I said, tracking. He said, not in the way that sounds. Monitoring. Making sure you're included in the extraction sequence. I said, and if our situation deteriorates before 6 weeks? He said, report it. They'll escalate the priority. He left 2 hours after he arrived. He came down to meet Earl. I'd called Earl on the Forest Service radio and told him, and Earl had come up the access road in an old pickup truck, the first time I'd seen him in person since the valley visit. Earl and Ben Hargrove shook hands and talked for about 10 minutes. I didn't hear everything. I heard Earl say, I've been in this valley longer than most people, and Ben say something that included the word essential, and Earl say, with a dry quality, son, I've been essential for 74 years and nobody told me once. Ben left, Earl stayed. Earl looked at the camp and at the tower and at the people and said, you've done all right up here. I said, we've had help. He said, most things worth doing do. He stayed for dinner, Pete's flatbread and the porridge and the beans, and he ate steadily and told stories about the valley that went back 50 years, stories about the families who'd farmed there, about the winters he'd seen, about the things the land did when you paid attention to it over a long time. People listened. Bonnie asked good questions. Dale took notes with the specific alertness of a historian recognizing primary source material. Owen fell asleep against Earl's arm at the fire. Earl looked down at him, and then looked at me across the fire and said nothing, but the look said enough. I'm writing this on day 17. The satellite transmitter has given us daily contact with the staging area. The contact is brief, functional, mostly position reporting and supply status. But it's real, and it's consistent, and it matters in a way that goes beyond the information itself. It means someone on the outside has us on a list, and is looking at that list every day. Ben Hargrove's information has been updating through the transmitter channel. The situation in the county is, the word they use is, stabilizing, and I'm choosing to take that at face value while holding my judgment. The affected population in the town is reportedly concentrated in certain areas. The unaffected people who survived are mostly gathered in groups of various sizes across the county, and the mapping process is assembling a picture of where everyone is. We are on that picture. We have been located. We are included in the sequence. I don't know if that's the same as being safe. I don't think anything is fully the same as being safe right now. But it's something specific, and it's real, and it's more than I had 2 weeks ago. The camp has improved. Carl and Ryan organized a firewood cutting and stacking operation that took 3 days and produced a supply that Nadia assessed as enough to maintain heat through February at minimum. We're using Earl's farm as a secondary supply base now. 2 people go down twice a week and come back with produce and eggs. The chickens have become a small miracle. Owen has taken an interest in the chickens, and Earl has been teaching him, in their brief encounters, things about chickens that Owen has been recording in his notebook with the seriousness of a scientist. The metal ground-level structure is no longer our only sheltered space. Carl rigged a second area under the extended tarps with a secondary heat source, a small wood-burning heater he found in the Forest Service maintenance cabinet. And that's where the larger group gathers in the evenings, around the heat and the fire and each other. Tess has started talking more. I don't know what changed. Something shifted in the second week. Maybe just time, maybe the stability of routine, maybe Abby, probably all 3. She talks in the evenings around the fire. She has opinions about things, which turns out to be a sign of someone coming back to themselves. Frank is still not fully at peace with staying. He asked me twice in the last week for status updates on the extraction timeline, and I gave him what I had, which was still approximate. He nodded and went back to his work. He's been the most dedicated at the firewood operation, working with a focused, almost aggressive energy that is probably the best possible use of the state he's in. Bonnie finished her Oreos on day 15. She announced it at dinner, with the gravity of a significant event. Pete said he was working on a substitute. He made something from a cornflour base that was not an Oreo, but was sweet and round, and Bonnie said, with diplomatic precision, that it was its own thing. I went up to the rock outcrop today, sat on the sandstone shelf with the view north. The valley below was quiet. Earl's chimney was going. The abandoned farm, the one where we'd taken the corn, had no vehicles in front of it today. The air was cold and very clear. You could see a long way. I sat up there for maybe 20 minutes. I was not thinking about anything in particular. I was just sitting in the cold and looking at the distance and listening to the wind in the remaining leaves of the trees below the shelf. Walter Halloran, whoever he was, had sat on this shelf, probably, many times probably, had looked at the same view, had seen something in this particular place, the height, the sight lines, the natural shelter, that was worth preparing for, had spent years, quietly, building something that he might never need, that no one might ever need. And then someone needed it. I don't know if Walter is alive. I don't know if he's in the valley below, or in the town, or somewhere else entirely. I don't know if he knows that the thing he built is being used for exactly the reason he built it. But I think about him, the specific kind of foresight required to build something for a future you couldn't see clearly, out of a conviction that preparation itself was worthwhile, regardless of whether the preparation was ever needed. Not paranoia, not fear, just the long, patient thought that goes, something might come, and this ridge will still be here, and this is what I can do now. I've spent 11 years writing emergency protocols for a county government. I've attended conferences and given presentations and written funding proposals and sat in rooms arguing about resource allocation. I believed in that work. I still do. But it was always work that depended on institutions, on the systems holding, on the departments responding, on the chain of command functioning. Walter didn't depend on the chain of command. He depended on the ridge, on the view, on the water 20 feet down the north face, on a jar with a good seal and a note that said, "Here is what you need." I've been doing emergency planning for 11 years, and I learned something from a man I've never met, from a note he left in a jar, about what preparation actually means. Day 20. Something happened this morning that I need to write down while it's clear. I was on watch in the tower, early, before light, the coldest part of the night just tipping into the first gray. The valley to the north was dark. The valley to the south, toward town, was dark, with the dispersed glow of things still burning, or buildings that had been burning, and now just smoldered. Owen came up the tower stairs. I heard him before I saw him. He's not as quiet as he thinks he is. He appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas with his coat over them and his sneakers, and he sat on the stool beside me without asking permission, which he knew was the protocol once you were up here. You could sit on the stool. You didn't have to ask. We sat together in the dark. After a while he said, "Dad, when are we going home?" I said, "I don't know exactly, but there are people working on a way to get everyone home, or somewhere safe, like home. It'll take a few weeks." He said, "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I miss my room." I said, "Me too." This was not quite true. I missed his room in the sense that his room was a thing that existed in a life that was not this life. But I understood what he meant, and saying, "Me too," was the right response to what he meant. He said, "But this is kind of okay too, right? Like right now, this is okay?" I looked at him. He was looking out the east window, which was starting to catch the first pre-dawn light on the horizon, a line of gray above the dark. His Lego astronaut was in his coat pocket, the small orange helmet visible at the pocket edge. I said, "Yeah, right now this is okay." He nodded, satisfied. We watched the light come in from the east. It took a long time, and then it was there. The ridge coming out of the dark, the trees, the clearing below, the camp, the cars, the tarps, and one or two people already moving around down there. Carl was always first up, and I could see his shape near the fire ring, getting the morning fire going. Owen saw it too. He said, "Grandpa Carl's up." I said, "He's not your grandpa." Owen said, "He lets me call him that." I said, "Then he's Grandpa Carl." Owen said, "Are we going to see Earl today?" I said, "Not today. Maybe in 2 days." He said, "I want to see the chickens again." I said, "I know." The morning light was coming in full now. The ridge lit orange and cold, and below us, the camp was waking up. More movement, a voice, the sound of the water pump going. Pete was at the propane stove. The smell of something cooking was coming up even to the tower, which seemed impossible, but was true. Owen slid off the stool and started down the stairs. He stopped halfway and looked back up at me. He said, "Dad, what was that thing you used to say at work, when stuff was going wrong?" I said, "What thing?" He said, "About the plan." I thought about it. I said, "No plan survives contact with reality." He thought about that. He said, "But we planned." I said, "We did." He said, "And it kind of worked." I said, "It kind of worked." He went down the stairs. I heard him reach the bottom and heard his sneakers on the gravel. I stayed at the window for a few more minutes, looking at the valley and the ridge and the morning light and the camp below and the distant smoke to the south, which was less today than yesterday, which meant something was changing down there, though I couldn't say what. The satellite transmitter's morning window was in 40 minutes. I'd report our position and status. 25 people plus 1. Supplies stable. No incidents. Location, Callaway Ridge. Day 20. What I wouldn't be able to report, because there was no field in the protocol for it, was what this day felt like from the tower at 6 in the morning. The quality of the light, the weight of the cold, the sound of a 9-year-old's sneakers on gravel below, the smell of something being cooked that was not what anyone would have chosen to eat, but was hot and was there, and someone had made it. But I'm writing it here, in Walter Halloran's logbook, in the column after T. Halloran's last entry from 2 months ago, because it happened, and it was part of this, and things that are part of something real deserve to be written down the way they actually were. Light from the east, camp waking, cold, smoke to the south, less than yesterday. 25 people, 26 counting Earl, getting through another day. The ridge, doing what ridges do, which is hold its position above the valley, while whatever happens in the valley happens. The plan that didn't survive contact with reality, and the people who did. I need to go. The morning window's opening and Carl needs help with the fire, and Pete is going to want someone to carry water from the pump, and Abby is coming off watch, and Owen wants to tell me something about the chickens that Earl told him. A fact about chickens that Owen considers extremely important. Day 20. Weather clear. Supplies stable. No incidents. We're okay. K. Hartley, Bryer County Emergency Planning Coordinator. Callaway Ridge Fire Lookout, Bryer County.